it's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Surveillance. Good morning, everyone. Francine Lacroix and Tom Keene. This election day, we are political today on an international and certainly on an American basis, but we must devolve to what we do, which is economics, finance, and investment. Edward Hyman is with Evercore ISI chairman. If Greenspan can say he's the one I read, well, that tells you a little bit about his leadership in market economics. His note is hugely coveted, as is his black pen, which is in the Smithsonian Institution. Ed Hyman, what are you writing with your black pen this morning? In the acclaimed note, what is the Hyman distinction this election day?
So the biggest problem is not the election, Tom, it's the virus. And as you know, it's going rampant in Europe. It's up about 100% on cases here. And that's the big risk. The market obviously is focused on the election. And in that regard, it's done. Investors have parsed every single aspect. They parsed what if Trump holds on, that's okay. What if Biden comes in? Well, that's a nice change. And the tax increases will come later and the fiscal stimulus will come sooner. And so that's okay. And if there's a contested election, we've gone through that too. And so investors have gone through every scenario and they've decided that the contested is the least favorable, and between Trump and Biden, both would be okay. And so the market was up yesterday and it's up today, waiting for any outcome that might show up.
Ed Hyman, the charm of your work, back to C.J. Lawrence, and again, I mentioned Alan Greenspan, I think the two of you are on the same page, which is granular analysis. In the micro-analysis you do of truck miles, railroad miles, and the rest, what do you see right now of the American experience?
The first thing that comes to mind is that the retailers, the consumer, are still doing well. Looking back, consumer spending in September increased a very strong 1.2% month to month. We survey retailers every week. And last week, they had a very good week. And it's been good for a number of weeks. So the consumer is still in there. And that's the first thing I noticed on that question. The second thing I noticed is what you're not even thinking about. China is leading. They went in first, they came out first, and their economy is still doing quite well. We surveyed 21 companies that do business in China, and that's increased a lot. And so whether I look, granular here or granular there, the economic backdrop right now is good. What worries me is we're going into colder weather, and the virus is going to pick up, and I'm worried that we'll get shutdowns, and that could put a air pocket in the economy until we get the fiscal stimulus that Francine, you were talking about, which we do need.
Yeah, we were talking about that, Ed Hyman. What I was also going to ask you is actually, if we have a Democratic president, Joe Biden, in the White House, with a Democratic Senate, does it change the dynamics in how we deal with this COVID-19? So does it, go back to lockdowns? Does it go back to listening more to what the scientists are saying?
I'm not sure on that, Francine. I mentioned the things that investors have straightened out on. This one is up in the air. And so if you get a Biden victory and the cases go up, there's probably a bigger chance that you have more restrictions or lockdowns that could, put a negative tilt on the economy. I've been optimistic on the economy for the fourth quarter because I did not expect the viruses to pick up so much. Didn't expect it to pick up so much in Europe, but they have. And so I've cut my forecast from 10% for the fourth quarter, following 32%, down to 4%. So I'm leaning toward that. But I think your point is right that the market knows that if a Biden victory, there's a little more chance of restrictions. I wouldn't say shutdowns, but I'd say more restrictions than if Trump is there.
Ed, you also mentioned China, the fact that they overcame the virus quicker, that they're back on track in terms of growth projections. How much do you worry about the relationship between the U.S. and China actually not changing, after a Biden presidency if he gets elected, so that it'll be different in form but not in substance?
Francine, I've pretty much given up. I thought that China and the U.S. would be coming together, say 5 years ago. And now it's pretty clear that the optimistic case is we just move in parallel tracks. We don't reinforce one another positively, and we just keep on moving, but not moving, in a synergistic fashion. But we're forecasting 8.5% growth for China in 2021, which is enough. It's big, and so that's enough to independently lift the economy. My general feeling is that we are spending so much time on the election, and there's so many big issues out there, some of them very negative, like the vaccine, like the virus, and I think the vaccine would be a positive, and then some of them positive, like China doing better. And I will say that one of my strongest views is that the amount of stimulus in the system, aside from fiscal, monetary stimulus is just ginormous and global. Balance sheets, money growth, interest rates, I think is being vastly underestimated as a lift for the economy. And so days when the market goes up like today or yesterday, I think about what you mentioned, Tom, don't fight the Fed, or don't fight the ECB.
Ed, I think so important. And a final question on this election day, if we could. You and I know the giants that have fallen too early. Of course, Paul Tsongas, the late Pete Peterson, and we lost Martin Feldstein before this election. The fact is the three of them would be appalled by this debt. They'd be appalled by this deficit. How did we work our way out of this within this political system?
So, when the facts change, I change, Sir Maynard Keynes. And MMT has the upper hand right now. The rates are still low, even though they're knocking on 90 basis points. Inflation is not there. We have the ability and we have the need to spend the money. So I would be in favor of more fiscal stimulus. And God bless Marty Feldstein.
Ed Hyman, thank you so much. With Evercore ISI, their chairman, thrilled he could join us in the early morning of this election day. We continue forward. We need a Democrat Party perspective, and Dr. Dean can deliver. He is the former DNC chair, but that barely describes Howard Dean's contribution to a fractured party 20 and even 30 years ago. On this election day, Republican or Democrat, Howard Dean will speak. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
History of having to support each other, right? And so there are opportunities that are presented that we don't often qualify for. So oftentimes we have to turn to our neighbor and turn to people within our community to assist us, to help us.
support and fund Black-owned businesses in the city of Oakland. The reason we started this fund due to the systemic racism behind the PPP funds, also how our Black-owned businesses have been marginalized for so long.
I'm standing here right now because we did get the resiliency fund. I only had enough to kind of just pay payroll for a couple of more months, but I said no new initiatives. Now that we have some new initiatives, we have other revenue streams coming in, and that's what's helping to keep things up.
CPG history, their experience, and really how we might be able to combine together to really create this fantastic public company. And so we kind of got into the SPAC thing a little bit before it became such a hot method of going public.
How you guys feeling? I come here to say, MAGA 2020. Don't forget that.
Now is your chance to vote against Donald Trump.
Do not vote for Sleepy Joe at all.
Vote for Joe. He's a good person. Now is the time to show up and vote like this country depends on it, because it does.
Yeah, I just love what Lil Pump did with drug addicts. I thought it was great. Some of the celebrities out there, Mr. Pump, Ms. Gaga, and others talking it up last night, they do that. The celebrities show up here just before election to have the crowds enjoy them before political messages are given. We have no celebrities before Kevin Cirilli. We just have Cirilli, who in his own regard is a celebrity, our chief Washington correspondent. He'll be leading our coverage here into the very late evening and into the morning of this election day. Kevin, what do you think you're going to be doing at 1 or 2 a.m.?
I think we're going to be waiting for Wisconsin. Look, the Democratic governor in the battleground state of Wisconsin, Governor Tony Evers, has said that actually they're anticipating a result in that key battleground state that President Trump carried in 2016 sometime between 3 and 6 a.m. I've got my eye on the suburban counties around Milwaukee, Tom.
Yeah.
Clearly the battleground counties around Milwaukee. Turnout in the city of Milwaukee, where the county, where the city officials there have said actually that they are also anticipating an early Wednesday morning vote tally, and this key battleground state is going to be fascinating.
Kevin, what about the People's Republic of Madison as it's known? I mean, do the college kids show up, or does the pandemic change that calculus in every Madison from sea to shining sea?
It's the biggest unknown in Packer country as well, because I think, you know, and I'm not joking here when I say this, but the celebrity appeal of someone like a Lady Gaga, it comes at a time in which college campuses all across the country have not really been open, or if they have been open, they have not been able to have the same voter registration drive, so to speak, that young voters typically have had, that the parties rather have typically enjoyed for the past several decades. Moving beyond Wisconsin, I would also keep my eye on Ohio, the 3 C's, Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland. How will they turn out? Are those cities going to be largely turnout? Because look, Democrats have made a last-minute play there. This is a state the president carried by something like 8 percentage points in 2016. They've only twice since going back to the late 1800s, Ohioans have picked a president. But now you've got Joe Biden making a last-minute stop there, looking for votes. Can he expand the map? If he wins Ohio, it's likely going to be a strong night for Democrats.
What about Pennsylvania, Kevin?
Well, Fran, in terms of Pennsylvania, so many different factions really going on right now. If you look at the collar counties outside of Philadelphia, if you look at the suburban Pittsburgh, but also up north in Erie, Pennsylvania, which President Trump was able to flip in the northern part of the state. Think near Michigan, for example. That is going to be something that Democrats are going to try to make inroads on. Fracking, energy policy. We talk about Pennsylvania. We always talk about the turnout in terms of diversity, in terms of the coalition that Biden is trying to recreate from the Obama years. But energy policy, especially in the final 2 weeks, has been a message that the president has been hammering home on the issue of fracking. Yes, it is true. The Democratic Party has shifted to the left in terms of a Green New Deal, so to speak. But in parts of the country, Michigan, Texas, Pennsylvania, fracking is still very much unionized Kennedy Catholic type of vote that President Trump was able to tap into Reagan Democrats. So very much watching energy in PA as well.
Kevin, mathematically, how much do we know about what each candidate will do as soon as they think they're the winner? It brings me back to 2000, where there was a contested election, and I think George W. Bush went in, Al Gore held back, and it put the Democrats on a back foot. Are we going to see a similar dynamic this time? Have you heard from what Joe Biden's camp wants to do?
Look, it's entirely possible. I'm always hesitant as a reporter to get into hypotheticals, but I'll be candid here. In terms of my prep work for covering this election, I did go back and watch the 2000 coverage in terms of how Al Gore and Bush and that whole dynamic that played out over the overnight and into the weeks that followed there. Because here's what could happen. This idea of a mirage, right? It's in the zeitgeist this morning, Tom, mirage, where you could have in the early morning hours tomorrow a concept where President Trump is leading in the Electoral College, gives some public statement of some kind. Joe Biden gives some public statement of another kind, and then a complete fight. A complete political fight in terms of the scramble to all of the votes being counted and absentee ballots being counted. Both sides. Right. Both sides are talking about their strategies in terms of how they are going to have the absentee ballots be counted. And it's different strategies for each. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. Let's first get through tonight.
Let's first vote. Kevin Cirilli, thank you so much, our Chief Washington correspondent. This is a joy. Howard Dean is a doctor, and after a medical practice, he wandered to Vermont, where he invented a new style of Democratic Party politics. We are honored that the former DNC chair will join us here. He was governor of the state of Vermont as well. I want to talk, Howard, about Biden running to the middle, running to the left, governing to the middle, governing to the left. It reminds me of Reagan long ago and far away. How would a President Biden do that? Be in the middle, be in the left, and get something done?
Well, my theory is that the left is being redefined. Certainly, AOC and so forth are left, but the vast majority of the seats we picked up in 2018 were center left or center. They were from middle of Pennsylvania. Yep. They were from Oklahoma, Texas, Orange County. So I think the country is moving left, but I'm not sure the party is moving left. There are some very vocal people on the left, and they've contributed a lot. But I just don't see it. I think we're a more centrist party than we were 4 years ago.
You supported Secretary Clinton against your senator from Vermont a number of years ago. Hans Nichols writes up in Axios about what to do with Warren, what to do with Sanders. What does President Biden do with them? Does he box them out of the cabinet?
No, absolutely. Well, that's a political calculation. That has nothing to do with who you want around you. Look, Joe Biden is a conciliator. He's been a conciliator for 50 years or 40 some odd years. So I don't expect that you're going to see a whole lot of acrimony. You may underneath, I think probably in the House, there'll be some division among the Democrats. If we do take the Senate, I expect a pretty unified front. So I think, whether Biden is a centrist or center left or whatever he is, his personality is such that he wants to bring people together, which is why I think he's doing well in this election.
Howard Dean, how confusing are you expecting the night to be? Is there a danger that Joe Biden announces he's the winner before he actually is, and the same for Donald Trump? Like, how much volatility are we going to see in the polls?
There's no danger of Biden announcing he's a winner before he is, because his team around him is really, really good. And I think he's run a terrific campaign, just exactly the right kind of campaign that you run against somebody like Trump. So I don't expect that. Who knows what Trump will do? He's always surprising us and will continue to surprise us. I think the results are going to be a little more clear than Kevin did. I think we're going to probably win Pennsylvania by a fair amount. I think there will be some conniving and some trying to move votes around. And so far, the courts have not permitted that. Now, they really let us down in 2020, although that was partly Al Gore's legal team that did that. The ultimate arbitrators for who gets to be president of the United States is not the Supreme Court. It's the Congress of the United States, and each state has one vote. It's a weird process. It's only been used once in 1876. We could have an orderly process. I think Trump makes it impossible. He hates orderly processes. But I think we'll have a reasonably orderly process. I do agree with Kevin. We are not going to know who the winner is. Certainly not today.
I was going to ask you, actually, when will we have at least mathematical president-elect?
Well, legally, we won't have it for 3 or 4 weeks, because until the electoral votes are sent to the Congress in December, we don't have legally a president-elect. Now, what usually happens is the networks look at the numbers and make the calls, and then somebody concedes. Well, this is an odd year. I think that's unlikely to happen. But it's going to be pretty clear, I think, within 4 or 5 days for sure who the president of the United States is, and probably before that.
Howard Dean, one final question, if I could. And then Mr. Biden of the early 70s, of the Watergate entrance into public service, all that's great. Are we electing, if Biden wins, the final Detrius, the echo of people like Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson of Washington State, of HHH? Is he the last whisper of a Democratic Party long ago and far away?
Yes. The coalition has completely changed. Young people, 73% of young people voted for a Democrat for governor in Virginia in 2017, who was, I would call, a boring centrist. Everything has changed. Young people are not necessarily Democrats, but they vote so heavily with us because the Republicans have essentially abandoned the things they care about. They care about things like climate change is the #1 issue, student loans, gay rights is the civil rights issue of their time, and the Republicans are hopelessly out of step with that. So as the Republican Party, the Republican Party is hanging on as a minority party. For the last 6 presidential elections, they have won a majority in 1 of them. I mean, there is no future in the current Republican Party, and it's just a question of time in terms of how long they can hang on.
What is the Pelosi mandate? What does the Speaker of the House do? She's a little fragile. I say that with immense respect. She said she wants to serve another 2 years with a Democrat majority in the House. What is the Howard Dean prescription for Speaker Pelosi's final 2 years?
Well, I think she's done what she really has to do, and I think Biden will do the same. We've got to bring a new generation into politics, and I think she started that process. Biden has talked about that. Most of Biden's staff is, except for his very senior staff that's been with him for 40 years, most of Biden's staff, many of them are in their 40s. I think you're going to see a very interesting cabinet, and I think that the average age of the cabinet is going to be barely 50. So, this is a transitional government that we're about to elect, I think, and I think we are about to elect.
10 seconds, Howard Dean. Would you be pleased to serve in the cabinet of a President Biden?
Yes, but I won't be asked. I'm 71 years old, and I'm really hoping he's going to be looking at people who are 41 years old.
Well preserved, I should point out, at 71. It's the Vermont air. Howard Dean, thank you so much, Doc. See, Dr. Dean, listening to his own medicine. Dr. Dean with us with the Democratic Party. We greatly appreciate it on this election day. Our coverage will continue through the day. Good conversation. We don't really get results. There's little results in the 6 o'clock hour, and then 7 o'clock tonight, our David Weston election 2020 through the evening. Cirilli wanders in at some point. I'll be on in the early morning with Francine to bring the clock around to awakening London, awakening Europe. Right now, with our first read news in New York City is Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, Tom. President Trump and Joe Biden have brought their bitter campaign to an end. They spend the final day rallying support in states crucial to deciding the outcome. Almost 100 million Americans have already voted. Biden is seen to have the upper hand with leads in national and most swing state polls. President Trump's counting on heavy turnout by his supporters today. A federal appeals court has denied a request by Texas Republicans to ban drive-through voting today in the state's most populous county. The Republicans said they wanted to prevent election violations. The court denied the request without an explanation. And reported coronavirus cases have hit an all-time high in the U.S., and hospitalizations have risen in 44 states. Battleground states in the elections are facing their worst moments of the pandemic. Wisconsin posted America's third highest cases per capita in the past week. 7-day average cases are at records in Michigan and Iowa as well. Hurricane Eta has strengthened into one of the Atlantic's most powerful storms of the year. It's roaring towards Central America with winds of 150 miles an hour. The Category 4 storm is expected to cause flash floods and life-threatening storm surges when it slams into Nicaragua today. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Ritika, thanks so much. Now, of course, it's U.S. Election Day, so happy U.S. Election Day to those who can vote. Don't forget to vote. We continue also tracking COVID-19. Up next, Amish Adalja, Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security Senior Scholar. That's coming up shortly, and this is Bloomberg.
Women leaders were actually better at controlling the deaths from COVID-19. Do you think out of this pandemic, we'll see more countries be willing to elect female leaders?
When we look at women leaders, we tend to project on them baggage that they shouldn't bear.
Women are given an opportunity when no one else wants to do the job.
Women had a very clear objective. They wanted to save lives.
The women leaders, if you look at their careers, have also built up a level of trust.
In fact, women have to be better at communication in order to be elected as leaders, whereas this doesn't hold true for men.
We need to get those sexist stereotypes out of our head and give women a fair run for leadership.
Trying to change the stereotypes about women is not only the business of women, but men have to be part of it.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I am moving up my stop on profit for both my positions to 117.01. So let's go to 117. Okay? So my stop on profit moved to 117. That's great, yeah? More profit for me. By the way, if you would like to get the strategy, you can see on Tika. I will post right now again the website where you can get it, just get it, read everything, subscribe to our channel and follow my trades, and you will get into this day trading in no time. So a couple of weeks or maybe less, and you will be professional day trader as well. Okay, speak to you later, guys.
To track the virus, Tom Bloomberg has developed a unique partnership with the leading authority on COVID-19. Johns Hopkins has been at the forefront of the international response, and every day we bring insight from experts in public health, infectious disease, but also emergency preparedness. I'm delighted today to be joined by Amish Adalja, Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security Senior Scholar. Amish, thank you for joining us. If you look at COVID-19 and actually the elections, how are you expecting briefings to change, but also lockdowns to be put in place depending on who wins today?
I think that the communication with the public could only improve if there was a change in administration. And I think that the public health measures that are put into place would only improve. That doesn't necessarily mean that lockdowns are what's in the future. We have to remember that lockdowns were used at a time when things were very dire in the country, where we had no ability to test, we had no contact traceability, and we had hospitals inundated. I think that right now what we'll see is much more targeted public health. Even as we move, even if there is a change in administration or if there's not a change in administration, that people have now realized that lockdowns have a lot of ancillary consequences in terms of other care for other medical conditions, in terms of the economy, and that you only want to do that if you're in dire straits and only for a very, very short period of time with clear metrics for lifting, not kind of an unending lockdown. So I don't think that that's what the United States has in its future. I think that that's sort of the European model, and that's the Wuhan, China model. I think we're going to get to hopefully a better test, trace, isolate model where we have very targeted measures when there are surges.
Dr. Adalja, if we cannot do a federal pandemic model, how does the federal government, assumed under President Biden, how do they impute a medical plan, a Dr. Fauci plan, upon governors and upon mayors?
Well, what we need to do is go back to what we've always done, and that's having the CDC lead a public health response. And what the CDC has done in the past is support states and local governments by having very clear guidance that is evidence-based, making their experts available to local and city governments and health departments so that they can actually implement that. And really talking to those individuals every day, trying to help people understand what's going on with the dynamics of the virus, come up with ways to think about relative risks of certain activities and how to make things safer. That's what happens in any other pandemic or any other infectious disease emergency. It's just that since February, when the CDC spoke frankly to the public, the president basically put them in the back seat and handcuffed them, and their whole modus operandi at that time became pleasing the president versus actually looking at reality.
Amish, what is the reality? What actually works? So, without talking about lockdowns, do non-important stores or non-essential stores need to close? Do people need to wear masks? Like, what have we learned about the virus and how it spreads? Is it different from what we knew back in March and April?
I think it's definitely different. Well, the biggest difference is that we know that pre-symptomatic people who don't have symptoms yet, can spread this virus. And that's where the mask recommendation came from, that there are people out there that have the virus that don't know it, that are contagious. And face coverings help to decrease the force of infection. That's the simplest thing we can do to avoid any kind of lockdown talk. If we can get people to wear face coverings very diligently, we will see a decrease in spread. The other thing is we should encourage telecommuting. We should encourage online ordering. We should have a lot of mindfulness when we're having mass gatherings, and we have to get people tested and traced, and people have to pick up the phone when the health department calls for contact tracing, so that those contact tracers don't have half of the calls going unanswered and half of those cases not even being logged. So that's what works. We've seen it work in Taiwan. We've seen it work in South Korea. It's becoming harder and harder to have it work in a place like the United States because we keep getting more and more cases because we failed to do it. But it will work, and it's been shown to work, and I think that's what we have to get back to is masks and test, trace, and isolate.
Amish, thank you so much. Amish Adalja there at Johns Hopkins, and be sure to check out VRUS Go on the Bloomberg for the latest information. You can also tune in every day for our exclusive conversation with Johns Hopkins experts for an inside look at battling COVID-19. Now, coming up next, Pascal Donohoe, the Irish Finance Minister and Eurogroup President. In conversation with Maria Tadeo, they'll talk about the EU Recovery Fund, and they'll talk about the second wave of lockdowns in Europe. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
Just days away from the most critical election in U.S. history, and it's only democracy at stake. From electronic voting machines to misinformation and fake news and political advertising on social media, is the tech industry ready for its biggest test yet? I'm Emily Chang, and we'll be focusing on these issues all week on Bloomberg Technology in a special electioneering series. Tune in 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific, only on Bloomberg Television.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Happy U.S. Election Day. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lackman, London, Tom Keene in New York. Now, joining us is Pascal Donohoe, the Irish Finance Minister and Eurogroup President, to talk about the lockdown, to talk about the recovery fund, in conversation with our Maria today. Take it away, Maria.
Right, good morning, Francine. And we are speaking with the Irish Finance Minister. He also leads the Eurogroup, Pascal Donohoe. Mr. Donohoe, I'm sure you watched Christine Lagarde last week when she said the risks for the European economy are now very much tilted to the downside. We have no visibility in terms of the pandemic. And, you know, the obvious question at this point is Europe headed into a double-dip recession?
Well, the economic challenges that we are facing due to COVID-19 are very great at the moment. But it is in anticipation of a difficulty like this that finance ministers within the Eurozone have put in place budgetary policies to support economic supports for all of 2020 within member states. And it's also the reason why we have work underway on the rollout of the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which is a central EU initiative of over 700 billion euro to support countries in dealing with the economic effect of this disease and trying to minimize the effect of it on jobs and on income.
Right, but does it take us or save us from a double-dip recession? I guess that's really the question in Europe at this point. Do you see one taking hold or not?
Well, it's difficult to say at this point because it does depend on the effect of the new public health measures that are being taken across Europe at the moment. The risk is clearly there. It's been recognised in different forecasts that have issued to date, but it is in recognition of that risk that the policies that I mentioned a moment ago were decided upon earlier on in 2020 and are now being implemented. The discretionary budgetary choices that are being taken by finance ministers within the EU are now equivalent to 4% of European national income, and they're being taken because we recognise that that risk is there. So I think the economic indicators in the weeks to come will make clear whether that risk is materialising, but our effort at the moment is trying to mitigate that risk and protect citizens.
Okay, and you say you're trying to mitigate the situation by putting new policy to work. There has been a lot of money put on the table, but the reality is that it's not been implemented. There's been a lot of back and forth over the recovery fund. There's a lot of back and forth over the European budget. When do we get this deal approved?
Well, the European budget was always aimed to be rolled out for next year. So in all of the discussion that has taken place in the European Union across 2020, we were always really clear that this was a fund that would have an impact in 2021. And this is the reason why member states of the European Union, in coordination with the European Central Bank, have run very accommodative budgetary policies for 2020. So I'm very confident that you will see agreement in relation to the rollout of the initiative on the timings that we had already agreed to, which was for next year. And Olaf Scholz, who is the German finance minister, as you well know, and holds the economic dimension of the presidency of the European Union, is working very hard with his team at the moment to get that agreement, and I'm confident that they will be successful.
Okay, so you do see the recovery fund being operational, 750 billion euros by the start of 2021 without any delays?
I think the most likely timing of it will actually be the second half of 2021, which again is always what we expected. This is the reason why national budgetary plans.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I am placing an order to sell short Canadian dollar at the price 139.59. Okay, let's see. 131.59, sorry. Okay, will I be able to sell it? It doesn't want to take my money, or it will take. Come on. I'm going down to 131.58. I'm placing an order, move down to 131.58 to sell short Canadian dollar. Still waiting for order to be executed, for confirmation from my broker, because I still using brokerage account. It's much more profitable for me. Come on. Let's see and wait, yeah, for a few minutes where the price will go.
Tonight at 7 p.m. in New York, that's 12 a.m. in London, and this is Bloomberg.
Ada 3 kelompok pengungsi tersebut yang sudah berpencar arah. Kemudian kami dari Polsek Banda Sakti berkoordinasi dengan perangkat desa Kampung Jomblang melakukan upaya pengumpulan secara.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I opened new short for Canadian dollar at 131.58.
Welcome to That's Debatable, an interactive series on today's most pressing issues. The resolution this time: is a U.S.-China space race good for humanity? We'll hear from both sides.
The competition, if you look at the past, led to innovation.
A whole new arms race could start.
And we'll get your perspective too, with help from the artificial intelligence of IBM Watson. I'm John Donvan. Join us for That's Debatable, presented by Bloomberg and Intelligence Squared, Friday on Bloomberg Television.
The time has come to elect the next president of the United States, and the stakes could not be higher. Two candidates, two very different paths for the future of the country. I'm David Weston. We will bring you the results as they unfold live on election night. Join us Tuesday, November 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
We're in the doldrums. We're in the stalling out sort of period. It looks like we're heading towards a double dip.
The consumer is very nervous.
We could be in for, a prolonged correction.
The duration of any sell-off is as important as the magnitude of that sell-off.
We are in a world that central banks, but increasingly governments, are having to address the weakness in demand.
We don't have safe havens anymore.
I find it difficult to build a portfolio that I think will be truly robust.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
From New York and London, for our audience worldwide, good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance live on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Farrow. With equity futures advancing 43 on the S&P 500, Tom Keene, the day is finally here.
The day is finally here. Over 1,000 days of campaigning. I believe it's 1,195 days of campaigning. John, I'm going to be direct. You do it better in the United Kingdom. I just wish the length here was a little bit more UK as a way. But yeah, we come down to what we've got today. Kevin Cirilli, our chief Washington correspondent, makes clear when he's on air after midnight, we're not going to know many of these outcomes.
We do it better because it's shorter and it's cheaper, Tom Keene. And to your point, Wednesday morning, we hope we have a result. This market fears, Tom, this could drag out for a long, long time.
Well, across this coast, John, sea to shining sea, we're having voting occur right now. We've seen a number of institutions already. How about the Bank of America Stadium in the Carolinas? Carolina playing Kansas City this weekend. This is the first Christian church of the disciples in West Palm Beach, Florida. It's a beautiful, beautiful church ravaged by hurricanes over the years, and yet today there is the peace and calm of a voting. John, I want to make clear that within the punditry, there's a question: how big will the turnout be after 98 million people choose to vote early?
The pundits everywhere all the time. It's always about the turnout, Tom. Here's the turnout. It's massive. No one knows what it means. Equities this morning, positive 44 on the S&P 500. Lisa, there is a nice cyclical tilt to this market rally of the last couple of days.
Yeah, actually an accelerating conviction in markets that regardless of who wins, or perhaps because they think that Joe Biden will win and there will be a blue wave, that Treasury yields are going to rise, that there will be some sort of reflation bet going forward. You know, John, we could have talked about the fact that there are September factory orders, or the fact that there were October auto sales, and you guys could have laughed at me and said, really, no one cares, because no one does care. Today is the final day of voting in the United States election. Tom Keene is exhausted. He's diplomatically saying, can we just make it end? 7 p.m. polls start to close in states including Georgia, Virginia, and South Carolina. We'll be looking as the night goes on, particularly for Florida. Pennsylvania probably won't know for a very long time. And then 1 a.m. tomorrow, voting ends with polls closing in Adak, Alaska, which has a population of about 340 individuals, John, the westernmost of the U.S. states.
I Googled that. I found out the same thing. Lisa, thank you. In the equity market, we look like this morning. S&P 500 futures rallying up 44. On the S&P, we advanced 1.3%. The internal rotation is there in the last couple of days. The underperformance of tech, the outperformance of the cyclical sectors. We can talk about that in just a moment. In foreign exchange, dollar weakness, euro stronger. Even the Aussie is stronger today after a rate cut of the RBA. Euro dollar back through 117. And in the bond market, curve steeper, yields higher, treasuries heading lower, 0.8671% is your yield on the US 10 years. So, Tom, last week, big sell-off. Monday, Tuesday, tidy rally going into this election.
Yesterday, a real rotation, as you mentioned, John, and we see it follow on today. I'm not going to do the percentage points here, but Dow moving sprightly, NASDAQ 100 maybe moving a little less. I like, John, how you bring up Australian dollar. George Saravelis at Deutsche Bank making very clear he partitions Trump and Biden separately for major currencies and separately for EM. And it's the usual thinking that you would see EM doing better under a President Biden than under a President Trump.
Broad-based dollar weakness, the story this morning, that's for sure. Good morning to you all. Our first guest of this morning, David Stubbs, JP Morgan International Private Bank Head of Market Strategy and Advice. David, fantastic to catch up with you, sir. Let me start with this. 4 years ago, if I told you the result 24 hours before it happened, would you have put on the right trade?
That's good. The great question, John. Certainly, there's a concept in markets of cascading realizations where the initial knee-jerk reaction is often then overcome as markets process the second level of reaction. Of course, that's what we saw in the Trump election in 2016. Remember it well. Initially, bond yields falling, then they started to rise. Equities initially risk off, then very much risk on as the market processed this candidate. Firstly, had probably unified government and was going to spend an awful lot of money and cut taxes, to boost the U.S. economy. So I think this time round, certainly under some scenarios, there's more consensus about what the market reaction would be. But there's also deep uncertainty about some of the other outcomes we might see, like the split government outcomes, and what that exactly means for stimulus in the short term and what it means for policy in the medium term.
David, update the JP Morgan view on this economy, Q4 and Q1. What do Casman and Ferroli and the team feel our growth will be around this politics?
Well, Tom, I think that we'd seen a remarkably strong rebound in the United States with the consumer manufacturing leading the way. But we have to also recognize that a lot of that rebound was stimulus driven, and we have not seen the kind of renewal of stimulus on the fiscal side that we all wanted and that we think is necessary. And certainly the absence of any further fiscal help will lead us to have to revise down our growth targets as we move through into the next year. You've already seen us take down our European targets in the fourth quarter to basically zero in a lot of countries on the back there of the renewed lockdown measures. I think this shines a light on one of the key areas of uncertainty, especially under, say, some of the split government results of this election, is what kind of stimulus, if any, do we get in the lame duck session, and then what do we get into the first quarter? And control of the Senate may absolutely determine that, and especially if we look at, say, the races in Georgia, where we could see a runoff only weeks and weeks from now, we could be still living in this uncertain environment around the stimulus for a while.
People talk about the uncertainty, but there is one high conviction bet out there, and you can see this in a variety of different ways, whether it's the record net short bet on longer dated U.S. Treasuries, or whether it's the biggest outflow from TLT, the longer dated Treasury ETF since March. Do you think that people are too confident that Treasury yields are going to rise?
I certainly think that a lot of people seem to be on that side of the ship right now, for sure. We've had a call since really the late spring, early summer, that the 10-year would be about 1% at the end of the year. We see it about 1.25 in the middle of next year. We're not that far away from that kind of trajectory. And certainly, broadly, cross-asset, you've seen, I think, a couple of things priced in here. I like to split it between process and policy. I think you've seen the pricing in of quite a smooth process. I mean, the polls are very clear about the lead for Biden. I think that we've seen a pricing out of some of the worries over a lengthy, messy, contested process. Apart from that, of course, you've seen the somewhat pricing in of the Biden agenda. If you look at the performance of clean energy stocks, for example, a great example there, some infrastructure plays, and that comes with it this higher bond yield, steeper curve play that we've started to see. Obviously, if it doesn't work out like that, and you've seen market price in some of these things, we could absolutely see some significant moves the other way.
David, you say process. Let's talk about policy as well. How dependent is that call on the 10-year to get to 1 year end, 125, middle of next year, on a clear path towards a fiscal stimulus package?
In the short, John, very, very, very dependent indeed, I think. I think you would need to see further support underneath the consumer. I think you would need to see any kind of restrictions or lockdown measures accompanied by further fiscal action, both at the state and the federal level. And of course, we know the interaction between state and federal is an important one. If we don't get further help to the states and the local municipalities, they'll have to cut employment. They'll have to cut some of the services as well. So we've not been too hung up about whether stimulus would arrive before the election or just after. If we're into January and February and still nothing's been done, I think then you'd have to be concerned about the growth outlook, and that would obviously have implications for rates.
David, we've been looking at Turkish lira out to 852, and it's grim and it's really discrete and idiosyncratic. I'm amazed at the strength that we see in EM currencies right now. What does that bode for EM equity investment?
Tom, I think the EM is really a case of the haves and the have-nots right now. Firstly, almost 80% of the benchmark is in North Asia, right? So we like a lot of that of those countries, be it China, Taiwan, South Korea. We know they're first in, first out, controlled the virus very well, have huge tech sectors that are actually playing better due to the disruption around the virus. And that's where, as I said, the bulk of the market cap is. And so we have no problem in taking significant exposure there. We actually added to EM in some of our multi-asset portfolios recently. Now, around the rest of the world, very different picture. You obviously have several economies that are being really badly stung by either the very low commodity prices, you see that in Latin America, or the almost complete cessation of tourist activities you see, as you mentioned, in Turkey. And so those countries are weak, or look like they're going to remain weak for the time being. We'd need to see, for example, take Turkey, we need to see significant action from the central bank, probably restoring real policy rates at least to being positive. They're negative right now. And we probably need to see signs of a capitulation or the move really in the lira getting to a point where clearly some players have been shaken out. We're not there yet. At the moment, we are watching it very closely. And we do see select opportunities, let's be clear, in credit in parts of, say, Latin America and Turkey, where we think the underlying issues are very strong, not really dependent on the local economy, maybe have dollar revenues. We've been actively engaged in those sides for sure, but equity, less so at the moment, only nibbling at the edges.
Around the world trip on this final day of voting in the United States. David, great to catch up, sir. David Stubbs there of JP Morgan International Private Bank. Headline crossing from JP Morgan asking all but essential workers in England to work from home. Tom, it's up to you whether you want to get Mr. Stubbs back and ask him if he's essential and whether he will have to work from home or whether he'll be able to go into the office. Of course he is.
He's
on this program.
That good looking,
clearly,
he's on the program. I mean, he's a star. He's essential. He's more essential than Mr. Diamond. I mean,
honestly, thank you so much for waiting before saying this, waiting for him to gracefully exit before going there, John.
I just want to get to the work from home issue and the shutdown, the lockdown in England, Tom, just briefly.
Please.
Massachusetts yesterday afternoon rather, implementing a mask mandate and some form of curfew as well. And Tom, I always think it's important. We're always focused on the shark closest to the boat, and that is clearly the election. But COVID cases are rising in the United States, and Massachusetts has made a move that is notable, I think.
Martin Walsh with us, the mayor of Boston, will give us wisdom on that. John, what is so important about this to me is hospitalizations. The driving constraint is the medical community.
From London and New York this morning, good morning. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg.
With the First Word News, I'm Rishika Gupta. There's never been an election day like this one. Almost 100 million Americans have already cast their ballots, and they did so in the midst of a pandemic that has killed more than 230,000 people here. President Trump and Joe Biden capped their bitter campaign with a push through states critical to deciding the outcome. The president said Biden is not mentally equipped for the office. Biden called the president a disgrace. Small New Hampshire communities that traditionally vote just after midnight have already tallied their ballots in the presidential election. It was a clean sweep for Joe Biden in Dixville Notch. He won the town's 5 votes. In Millsfield, a slightly larger town, President Trump won 16 of the 21 votes. In Vienna, authorities say the gunman who killed 4 people was an Austrian North Macedonian dual national who had a previous terror conviction. The suspect was killed by police, and it's not clear if he was acting alone. But police made a number of arrests in raids this morning. In addition to the fatalities, another 17 people were wounded in the attacks. Authorities say shots were fired at 6 different locations. And Prime Minister Boris Johnson says there's no alternative to imposing a coronavirus lockdown across England. Johnson revealed plans for entire cities to be tested to root out asymptomatic carriers of the disease. Lawmakers from Johnson's own Conservative Party raised concerns about civil liberties and mental health. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
Tomorrow we are going to win this state, and we are going to win 4 more years in the White House.
Decency, honor, respect. Where has it gone with this president? Well, let me tell you something, folks. Tomorrow's the beginning of a new day.
President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden yesterday at their final rallies ahead of today's election. From London and New York this morning, good morning. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Live on Bloomberg TV and radio, this is Bloomberg Surveillance, and here is the price action. Up 40 on the S&P 500 this Tuesday morning. We add some weight to the benchmark in the United States, up a little more than 1%. In the FX market, dollar weaker against pretty much everything in G10. Euro back through 117. We're up 0.5% on that currency pair. And as you get get that cyclical tilt beneath the surface of the equity market in the last couple of days, that rotation to the financials, materials, industrials, away from big tech. You also see a corresponding move in a treasury curve, steeper, yields higher, treasuries lower. We're up 2 basis points on a 10-year, Tom. 86 basis points is your yield on a US 10-year.
Very good. We were just looking moments ago at Montpelier, Vermont. They're voting up there in the capital, the gorgeosity of Howard Dean's Vermont. Dr. Dean was here moments ago. It's 106 miles from Dixville Notch and those first votes down to the southwest to Montpelier, where every vote counts in a very interesting part of the nation. Kevin Cirilli will not be counting votes in Vermont or New Hampshire, not part of the tension here today. But as our chief Washington correspondent, he'll be looking at the other little towns. I think, Kevin, to talk about Montpelier or to talk about Dixville Notch really shows the importance of every little town. What have you gleaned from the little towns of America in the last few days?
Well, look, here we are in what is an American tradition. I mean, this is a tradition and a ritual that Americans have participated in since the founding of our country. And so I think to your point, while it is important as we sprint through today, as well as the early hours tomorrow, and maybe even the days after, that we take a moment to pause, take a deep breath, and acknowledge the historic nature of today. You're right. Now, with that said, I don't have my eye on Vermont. I do have my eye on Erie, Pennsylvania, up in northern Pennsylvania.
Well, talk about that. This is important.
State.
Oh, wait a minute, Kevin. This is important. You go down the New York State Thruway, you go down the back of Lake Erie on the way to Cleveland, and there is the collapse of American industrial industry, I should say, in Erie, Pennsylvania. Continue.
Precisely. I mean, if you want to get an idea of U.S.-China or USMCA trade relationships, go to Erie, Pennsylvania. And it's the Great Lakes states, right? That's what we're talking about. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And I think that's really where that's one of the counties, rather, that President Trump was able to flip from Hillary Clinton back from Obama years. And so that's one of the swing counties in this state. You know, it's not just Pennsylvania. You go to Minnesota, I think Minneapolis, Minnesota, the site of the George Floyd protests over the summer. I think that's another example of where you could see a state, if President Trump is going to have a good night in Minnesota, then that could be a positive night for Republicans across the board.
Kevin, everyone on the outside looking in at the United States right now, taking note of this huge turnout, huge amount of early voting. And we joked at the top of the hour that every single pundit always goes on TV, on radio, and talks about how important turnout is. Here's the turnout. It's huge. Kevin, why is it important? No one really seems to know right now what it actually means.
Yeah, I don't want to be a pundit. I'm a reporter. So I think, as you just correctly spoke to, Jonathan, if you look at the data of the early introduction of the data that we've seen from the 90+ million votes that have already been cast in this election, look at the demographics. Where have those votes really come in from? Harris County. We've been talking a lot about Texas. I mentioned it a few weeks ago. In a major metropolitan area of Texas, that has shattered records. And that was, of course, the site of where 2 local Republicans had what is likely to be a failed attempt to get drive-through ballots thrown out. So that's another example here. But if you look at the broader chronology of this evening, you could have a mirage situation early on where early ballots in Florida look like very good news for Democrats, and then as more votes come in, it starts to shift. You could play that scenario out for both sides and both pendulums, but patience, right? We've all got to practice patience tonight as we get these results, because it's not what comes in first in the early tabulations. It's after every vote is counted.
Hey, Kevin, I want to switch to Riviera Beach north of Miami. This is where the Bahamians came years ago. The people of the Bahamas, very much African-American. And at Riviera Beach, it speaks to the black vote in Florida. It speaks to the black vote nationwide. Will they deliver for President Biden as the stereotype?
Well, that is what Biden is hoping. And it's not just in Riviera Beach, it's also in Nash County, North Carolina, another swing district where with a predominantly African-American.
I'm placing a stop on profit for Canadian dollar at 131.56. Sorry, it's too late. Broker didn't get this order. Okay, I'll wait until it will go down further. So I still hold short position.
The overall election. In other words, how quickly could we learn about Florida and thus potentially the outcome of the election?
I think if we get early results for Biden in these battleground states where turnout is so significant that he's going to have a good night. But really, I think Georgia's fascinating. Georgia's a battleground state. It's got a massively important Senate elections, plus a runoff two Senate elections. You've got this whole issue of a runoff election that could happen on January 5th with the Senate. And Georgia really could be the deciding factor in terms of who is able to control the Senate. Senator David Perdue, the Republican incumbent, up against a Democrat, Jon Ossoff. And then you've got, again, a second special election that happens. It's fascinating. I mean, this is a political junkies. It's so incredibly important to deciding the Senate that Georgia's going to be remarkable.
How was the birthday, Kevin? That's what really matters. How'd it go?
You know what? I am. I'm in my prime. I'm in my element right now. I'm in my element, so it's good. It's a good birthday.
Was this the birthday gift?
This right now. This moment is the birthday gift. Truly, it's election day. Let's have a great 48 hours. Dare I say?
Yeah, I'm going with 30 hours, but John,
fantastically committed Kevin Cirilli.
And what's great on this, John, is with your light TV load, you can help Kevin out here when he picks it up from David Weston later tonight.
I would be happy to do that, Tom Keene. Kevin, thank you, sir. I can tell you, Tom, that Kevin is so committed. He was not due to be on with us this morning.
I didn't know that.
And he got on the phone and he asked to make an appearance.
Really?
That's the level of commitment from this man. He starts now. Yeah. He will be with us in 24 hours' time on no sleep.
That's very cool. I mean, there's no question. What do you see in the market, John? I mean, the market's like
a real lift.
It's like a lift. Yeah,
Last
look
couple
at
of
oil.
days, a real cyclical tilt. Crude catches a bid. Maybe OPEC backs away from not backing away from those production cuts.
Enough market talk. Back to politics.
It's election day in America. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Women leaders were actually better at controlling the deaths from COVID-19. Do you think out of this pandemic, we'll see more countries be willing to elect female leaders?
When we look at women leaders, we tend to project on them
baggage that they shouldn't bear.
Women are given an opportunity when no one else wants to do the job.
Women had a very clear objective. They wanted to save lives.
The women leaders, if you look at their careers, have also built up a level of trust.
In fact, women have to be better at communication in order to be elected as leaders, whereas this doesn't hold true for men.
We need to get those sexist stereotypes out of our head and give women a fair run for leadership.
Trying to change the stereotypes about women is not only the business of women, but men have to be part of it.
Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
From London and New York for our audience worldwide, good morning, good morning. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg Surveillance live on Bloomberg TV and radio, and here's the price action this Tuesday morning. Shaping up as follows, with an equity market getting a lift up 41 on the S&P. We advanced a little more than 1.2%. In the bond market, Treasuries lower, yields higher, curve steeper, up 2 basis points on a 10-year to 0.8654%. And in foreign exchange, quick snapshot at G10 for you. A dollar that is weaker against absolutely everything, can flat against the Japanese yen. The krona on top, oil outperforming in the commodity market. Really nice lift on Brent and WTI after the absolute battering it got last week. The Aussie positive too, the New Zealand dollar up there, Tom, cable advancing too, and a euro with a 117 handle. There is a cyclical tilt to this market worldwide going into this election.
There's no question about that. There's been some real movement, and it's been very subtle, folks. Looking at the screen, it's been ever changing. I'm watching the real yield, which is a number of people have commented on, John, and, you know, the negative 0.86, that's in a better position than the grimness that we saw 10 days ago.
The market is in a much better position, but investors have one big fear. It's a contested election, and this is what Dan Arndt of BNP Paribas had to say.
What I'm most worried about is come January 20th, there's still no clear picture as to who the president of the United States is, and both Joe Biden and Trump show up claiming that they're the legitimate president. The implications of something like that are just so unfathomably profound that it's hard not to believe that that's going to have a pretty dramatic effect upon markets and the economy.
Tom, that's been the fear of this market, I would say, for the last several months, but it's been a pendulum. It's been the fear over contested to a blue wave and what that means, and then back all the way over again going into the vote.
Greg Valliere publishing moments ago, folks, from AGF, and he suggests a, quote, light blue wave. I'm not sure what that means, John, but we'll go with it with the color of Mr. Valliere. Futures up 41. A joy on this election day to have Louis Alexander with us of Stanford and Yale University, with Nomura, their chief U.S. economist, and someone who always writes careful notes. Lou, behind your measured note is the reality of President Biden or President Trump, which is there are two Americas. There seems to be an America still prospering, and then the angst that we see out there, the anxiety of so many other people. How does any new president in the next term apply policy to two Americas?
So you're right, there are big divisions, and that was true before COVID, but COVID has made things worse. Look, I do think the fiscal response has got to deal directly with some of the economic consequences of that. So I do think it's very important to see, regardless of who's president, whether or not we get continued fiscal support that helps deal with the immediate impact. But over the longer run, you've got to try and deal with these gaps. I do think there are things you can do. I do think that there are ways we can kind of restructure the economy that can reduce inequality. I do think that that's going to be important to the long-run health of the economy. We'll see whether or not we can get that. One of the things that's very important to remember is it's not just about the president, it's what happens in Congress. To me, the biggest downside risk is that we get divided government and gridlock. So Biden in the White House, Republican Senate, that I think has the potential to be the worst outcome because it means we're going to get much less fiscal support, and that's going to be a real near-term problem.
Lou, are traders and economists underestimating the momentum in the U.S. economy? I think about yesterday, the manufacturing numbers that we got out that absolutely blew away expectations and came in the strongest in several years.
So we've been revising our forecasts up, and I'm guilty of this in the sense of the benefits of reopening have been stronger and more durable than we had expected, particularly in an environment where obviously we've got a resurgence of COVID and the fiscal support has waned. I think there's got to be a question about how far that can run. Obviously, things have gotten much worse in Europe, and we are going to have to deal with COVID going forward. So I think there's a limit to it, but there's no question that many analysts, myself included, have underestimated that momentum.
We welcome all of you on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television. Louis Alexander of Nomura with us today, and the images on television for our radio listeners of Riviera Beach, Florida, a key state north of Miami with a large African-American community where President Obama has been very visible for his vice president in the last days. John?
Tom, we've talked so much about how important the economy will be for this election. This economy is difficult to read. Lou, Lisa brought up the ISM in the last 24 hours, and it's a brilliant point. It was really on fire. Momentum in the U.S. economy clear in manufacturing. Do you expect it to hold up on the services side in the months to come?
We're expecting the ISM services index, which we're going to get on Wednesday, to be roughly in line with where it's been. There's some upside to that, but look, there are these two forces that are very big. One is the resurgence of COVID-19 and the fact that we are starting to see some evidence of mobility falling off. It's not going to be as severe as we saw in the spring, but that's got to be a factor. The other thing is we have gone over the fiscal cliff. The fiscal support that we provided in the spring has waned, and that's got to have effects as well. So I do think there's a lot of momentum, but there are limits to how far that can go, particularly in an environment where the rest of the world isn't doing so well either.
Well, that's what I wanted to add on, Lou, the limits of that divergence that we could see between manufacturing and services. We see that spread in Europe right now. Manufacturing is holding up in expansionary territory on the PMIs, whilst you've got services negative. Do you think that spread can persist, Lou, in places like Europe and elsewhere?
Yeah, if you look at the lockdown policies that are being imposed in Europe, there's an important distinction that in the spring, they were very broad and included manufacturing and construction. They are not doing that this time. They are more focused on the service industries that are particularly vulnerable to social contact. And so I do think that that is going to persist in the way that the Europeans have responded to the resurgence of COVID. We here in the U.S. so far have been much more reluctant to go down that road. And so I think it's not quite as obvious that we're going to see that here, but it's the risk. And look, we are behind Europe in terms of where this COVID outbreak is at this point. And if it gets worse, we're going to have to consider doing more. I don't think we're going to do as much as the Europeans have done, but I do think you're going to see that divergence continue in Europe.
Lou, we hear a lot about this fiscal support package, that we need another one. People were saying that. It did not happen, and yet the numbers have maintained their pace and really outperformed what economists were expecting. How big, given the strength that we've seen in the economy so far, how big does some sort of fiscal effort have to be in order to prop up growth to the levels that you're currently pricing in?
So we think we need essentially another $2 trillion in sort of immediate fiscal support to basically offset the drag that we're going to get over time. So one of the ways to think about it is the support that's been provided so far, the tax rebates, the PPP, the extended unemployment benefits, have given people a cushion. They're using it now. It's clear that consumption in some sense is above what income would support, particularly for the people that are most affected. That can't go on forever, and that is going to turn into fiscal drag next year if it is not replaced. So I think we need something on that order. to sort of offset those effects and to get decent growth in 2021.
Louis Alexander, thank you so much for joining us with Nomura, their chief U.S. economist this morning. And of course, we move on to a Fed meeting tomorrow, I should say Thursday rather, not Wednesday, Thursday. And that will be interesting to see. Many saying that they will try to stay out of trouble at their Thursday meeting. Right now in trouble is Stephanie Kelly with Aberdeen Standard Investment. She has a really interesting mandate at the large investment management firm of trying to figure out what all this means for investment management, in particular longer-term money. Stephanie Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. What does this mean for active management? How does election play into the investment management industry next year?
I think, if anything, the U.S. election illustrates just how crucial that role really is for asset managers, because if we look at what a Biden administration...
I'm placing an order to stop and sell my position on Canadian dollar at 131.57. Okay, stop placed at 131.57.
Summarize the state of populism right now. We have this terrible terror attack in Vienna, Austria, the state of populism in Austria, in England, for that matter in Canada, and certainly with Mr. Trump in America. The state of populism on this election day.
So I think there's a couple of ways to think about populism. We tend to focus on right-wing populism, and I think that's been the one that's been the most successful in recent years. Indeed, you look at places like the French 2017 elections, we look in the US, we look to the UK. That seems to be where the kind of populism support is growing. I think the one to watch for investors, though, is in the next kind of year or so, it's actually Italy, because although at the moment we have this coalition which is relatively stable and for now seems quite stable, but my fear is that that kind of is hiding what is underneath, which is that actually the majority of support for parties in Italy is for populist parties, and in particular it looks as though a right-wing populist coalition could be the next government when we get to the next election. So that's one to watch for the next year. It's not near-term risk, but it's definitely one to bear in mind that Italy is this
Position closed on Canadian dollar at 131.57.
Not right now.
Stephanie, to state the obvious, there is upside risk as well as downside risk, and I wonder what we're learning about what populism actually means for financial markets.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that, you know, we use this kind of term populism in a very broad sweep. What matters is, like, what are the policies that they're incorporating, or are they making a risk event, you know, bigger than it would be otherwise, right? So an election is a good example. I think here we probably need to veer away from just the populism and think more about that polarization, right? It's not just that you've got parties on the far right or the far left. It's that those more centrist parties can also pull apart. And in the US, a prime example, we're looking at a Democratic Party that's much further left than it was 4 years ago against a Republican Party, which remains kind of quite conservative at its core, although, of course, Trump has kind of implemented this additional element. I think what that means is that from one election to the next, you can get a lot of swings, and that's where the risk comes in for investors, at the short-term risk. And then really the question, as I mentioned, it's once you're over the event, once you know the result, once the uncertainty is gone, what does regulation look like? What does legislation look like? And what does that mean for the companies you're investing in? That's the way we have to think about it.
Stephanie, just to build on that sort of connection between markets and politics, can you give us a granular sense of the process of how you work with investment managers, whether you're looking at long-term plays or short-term plays, based on some of the political developments that you were just talking about?
Sure. So there's a couple of ways that we do this. The main was when I started doing this kind of political analysis in the asset management industry, which I have to say, there aren't that many political economists floating around the asset management industry. And so I was quite struck by the extent to which there just weren't these frameworks in place to think about politics. So I always say to our investors, to our clients, you know, you have to think in scenarios. It's not enough to just have a base case. Investors always anchor on this kind of base case approach. When it comes to politics, you have to accept there's a lot of information you don't know. We don't know if polls are accurate until they're proven accurate or inaccurate. We don't know how politicians are feeling inside. We can do lots of engagement. We can do lots of research. But I think the best way to think about it is not single base case, what's going to happen, but what's the distribution of risks here? And then from that say, okay, this is the distribution of political risks. What happens to markets in each of those scenarios? And then that way you have not only a distribution of political risk, but actually of market risk. And then you have a better understanding of how exposed you are to a given outcome, be that Brexit, be that US-China trade relations, or indeed the US election.
Stephanie, probably the most prominent political economist these days, or moonlighting perhaps as a political economist, is Ray Dalio of Bridgewater. He's been talking a lot about the rise of populism, about the inequality, and about cash is trash, the expectation for inflation in the United States. Do you agree with his conclusions based on his assessment of the political landscape?
I mean, I think that there's a lot to parse out in terms of that connection. I think we should never kind of be too quick to rush into what it means. And in particular, I think, there tends to be, particularly that relationship, and I don't mean specifically to Ray Dalio here, but there tends to be this discussion that takes place whereby more government intervention equals lots more inflation. And I think we really need to put that in the context of what other political kind of issues are going on. And one big one is actually, the globalization element, but also the kind of cyclical weakness and the structural weakness. Those things push and pull against inflation in different ways. And so I think it's another example of where we've got to be quite careful and kind of considered when we think about each individual risk and how that plays into these big macro themes, which still also rely on kind of, bread and butter economics, right? What's being produced, where's the demand, where's the supply?
The imagery is important. We're the Stephanie Kelly, and for all of you on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television, through the early morning of a graveyard, the Vice President, Joseph Biden, attending church at St. Joseph in Delaware. I believe we've lost those images, which is good for radio. It never works on radio. But Joe Biden at church this morning to begin his election day. Lisa Bramwitz, there is such a stark contrast between these two candidates and the attendance of church made large by the president's appearance across Lafayette Square during the protests of previous months.
Well, it's definitely been a moment of imagery, and we are going to see how these two candidates are going to craft their imagery heading into the evening. The key question, I think, is going to be how social media handles both candidates, John, when you look at the possible restrictions on them declaring victory too soon.
Well, we'll see. Interesting to see at the election, and of course, it's 7:45 on the East Coast of this election day. John, important images there.
Very much so. We've got to thank Stephanie Kelly of Aberdeen Standard Investments. Stephanie, thank you very much for joining us. I'm pleased to say that Chris Ferrone joins us now, Strategas Partner and Head of Technical and Macro Strategy. This is how this program works. We threw out a question about an hour ago about whether if you knew the election result 24 hours ahead of the last election 4 years ago, would you have put on the right trade? And Chris, straight away, get me on the phone. I want to phone in. Chris is with us now. So, Chris, what is your response, sir?
Hey, John, it's a great question. I think too much information is a bad thing in this business, and what we're reminded of is how powerful the trend of the market is. And what we've seen in almost every election going back to 1950 is whatever the trend of the market is going into election day, that tends to persist after election day, irrespective of what the outcome is. 85% of the time, what's happened the last 3 months continues over the next 3 and 6 months. So we defer to trend. I think the market's trend is up. I'm not sure today's outcome is going to do a whole lot to change that.
Chris, is that an index trend? Is that a sector trend? Is that cross-asset? What is that trend that you're looking at?
Yeah, I'm speaking specifically about what is the primary trend in the S&P 500. Something as simple as is the 50-day moving average trading above the 200-day on the S&P. And when you've entered election day with that being the case, 85% of the time, the market's positive over the next 3 and 6 months by margins that are far greater than what the historical averages are. Conversely, when you've entered election day with the market in a downtrend, the forward returns over the next 3 and 6 months have been pretty miserable. So I think the trend tells you more about any specific headline risk or any specific geopolitical event. Trend here is up. We bet markets up 3, 6, 12 months from now.
Chris Ferrone, thank you so much for joining us today. There was a history of 2016 of 9, 10 days down in a row, and then a moonshot up off the market. Do the charts tell you that now? Is it a redux of 2016? Can you bet on a moonshot, whomever wins?
Markets do a very good job. They're fairly efficient at discounting well-known events ahead of time. And we just had an 8% correction in the S&P. So I would sit here thinking on election day that the market's already discounted the risk of an unknown outcome or a contested event. So I think markets discount this stuff as they likely discounted Trump the first time in 2016. You saw it and you see it right now in the volatility market. The VIX curve is about as backwardated as I've ever seen. You have spot VIX trading so many points above forward VIX. That can be a sign people are already positioned for chaos.
Yeah, the only backwardation we have is when John Farrow does yoga over in West London with all the beautiful people. What is backwardation?
Backwardation is the spot contract is trading well in excess of the future contract. So right now, spot VIX is somewhere between 7 to 10 points higher than the December and January contracts. That's a very, very unusual shape of the volatility curve. And I think it reflects all the hedging that's already been done before this election. So our point being, the market has already discounted what is the worst case outcome, an unknown event or a contested election. Now, that stands in stark contrast to what we saw going into the 2000 election, right? You know, you think about the contested or the unknown outcome in 2000, the market was not prepared for that. I think a little bit different this time around.
Very good. I believe we've got some images here, Riley. Is that correct? As we look at polling today on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg TV, people over the desk doing it by hand. No Chads attended here, not the voting booths of another time. And it is Novi, I should say, Michigan, and of course, north of Metro Detroit. And certainly, John Farrow, we're hearing from all reports, Michigan is absolutely key and critically has been tilting towards Mr. Biden in recent days.
Yeah, this one is different though, isn't it, Tom? Will we actually get a result Wednesday morning? And this speaks to what Chris Verone is discussing with us right now. The trade to put on, do you ignore the noise? Or Lisa, do you just stick with the trend and try and just look through with a lot of the volatility that may emerge in the coming days?
Yeah, but some of the trends are incoherent. And Chris, this is where I wanted to go with you, because you're talking about the strength that seems to be building in equity markets. We're also seeing yields rise, and there is momentum behind that within positioning as well as in the trend lines. How coherent is it for Treasury yields to keep on rising from here in tandem with this reflation trade? Yes, that's good for banks, but it also does hamper the benchmark valuations that we see in equities.
Lisa, I think it's a great question, and something that we've talked a lot about over recent days. And what I have found maybe most notable is, despite virus concerns, despite new lockdowns in Europe, despite election risk, as you say, bond yields haven't flinched. 10-year yields just continue to march higher. The 2-10 curve, the yield curve, is at about a 3-year high. Groups like materials and industrials have continued to forge ahead as leadership. So I would kind of go back to what we said earlier. I don't see the market having changed a lot over the last several weeks. I think the leadership has been remarkably resilient and remarkably consistent. And I think it gives us a little bit of a heads up of what leadership's going to look like on the other side of all these events. During market corrections, right? We've been in a market correction here. S&P came in 8%. We always look to what groups are exhibiting leadership. They are typically the groups on the other side that continue to work. Industrials, materials, machinery, even some of the banks recently, all check those boxes.
Although at the same time, Chris, the dollar hasn't been as clear-cut of a story. You actually saw strengthening over the past week. Today, you are seeing the weakening trend pick back up. Where is the momentum there?
I think the primary trend of the dollar is down. We've had this oversold rally over the last month or two. I'm more inclined to be a seller there. And I think when you look at some of the other conditional elements around the world, whether it's copper strong, gold is holding in there, the strength we've seen in the agricultural, the strength we've seen in industrials, the strength we've seen in materials, these don't sound like strong dollar events right now. So I'm of the camp that you sell dollar rallies, primary trend of dollars down.
Chris, great to catch up. Appreciate the phone call, sir. Thank you. Chris Verone there, strategic partner and head of technical and macro strategy. The President of the United States is talking to Fox News in the past hour. This is what he has to say. Vaccines are coming. We're rounding the corner on the virus. The counterpoint to that, Tom Keene, would be what happened in Massachusetts in the last 24 hours. It does not look like we're rounding the corner up there.
Well, it is a debate, and certainly he has supporters across his recent campaign rallies who believe the same way. It'll be fascinating to see, John, with the workout of this election, how policy will change on that. On Bloomberg Radio, on Bloomberg Television, we are moving around the nation, looking at some of the images of this election morning in Dallas. We looked at images from the American Airlines Center. This is where the Dallas Mavericks and the Stars play. We saw that with the Bank of America Center in the Carolinas as well, where the, I should say, stadium, where the Panthers play as well. And of course, Lisa, Texas is, I guess, a purple state. And I guess Kevin Cirilli has told me it is really nuanced this time around.
Yeah, and actually President Trump and Republicans lost a recent case to discount some of the votes that were done by drive-through. It was about 120,000 votes. The fact that this is a potential turning point for the election, that there's 120,000 votes and whether to count them or not, and that's such a pivotal issue, tells you how close it is, Tom, and how different the landscape is in a traditionally red state.
In the busy news flow, John, the federal court's weighing in off the Texas Supreme Court and agreeing that votes should be counted, and really a remarkable occurrence, more of a political judicial system in Dallas and in Texas, and where the Republican court pushed against their own Republicans. John?
Tom, a really important distinction that you're making here, though, the amount of time that it will take to count the vote. That's one reason why we might not get a result tomorrow morning. Yeah. It's not just about whether this will be contested over a long period of time. You might just have to wait. You mentioned Texas. Tom, you might have to wait for Pennsylvania for several days too.
Yeah, well, Kevin's made very clear this morning that is the case. John, I would say tonight, as David Weston begins our coverage, there's going to be a lot of action, folks, in the 7 o'clock hour. It's really going to be interesting. And John, as we showed Riviera Beach north of Miami there moments ago, Florida is really front and center early.
Georgia, when the polls close at 7 Eastern, the people that were talking about a huge blue wave, Tom, they've talked about Georgia being in play as well, and I think that'll be the first one that people start to look to a little bit.
With those two Senate races as well. John, I don't see much on the market. I would say within the blinky of the Bloomberg terminal, it's sort of a quiet market day, but I guess that's to be expected.
You're hard to please. You are hard to please, sir. Monday we had a big rally. Tuesday we added some weight to that, Tom. Equities with a lift, treasuries lower, the curve steeper. What more do you want? Is that why you're disappointed? Because this market's not lower?
A little nervous.
I hear you. The coverage continues for our audience worldwide tonight, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. This is Bloomberg.
Just really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Just days away from the most critical election in U.S. history and its only democracy at stake. From electronic voting machines to misinformation and fake news and political advertising on social media, is the tech industry ready for its biggest test yet? I'm Emily Chang, and we'll be focusing on these issues all week on Bloomberg Technology in a special electioneering series. Tune in 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific, only on Bloomberg Television.
We are in the doldrums. We're in the stalling out sort of period.
It looks like we're heading towards a double dip.
The consumer is very nervous.
We could be in for, a prolonged correction.
The duration of any sell-off is as important as the magnitude of that sell-off.
We are in a world that central banks, but increasingly governments, are having to address the weakness in demand.
We don't have safe havens anymore.
I find it difficult to build a portfolio that I think will be truly robust.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Good morning, everyone. Jonathan Farrow, Lisa Abramowitz, and Tom Keene on this election day for the nation. The ramifications are worldwide, indeed, coast to coast, with the first votes in the two towns of Dixville Notch and Millsfield, New Hampshire, and then on to the polling occurring right now. With that is information flow, and John Farrow, we've got to bring it right up to the moment where one of the candidates is on his favorite network, Mr. Trump, saying he will only declare victory if there is one. I guess that's a change.
The president adding to that as well, saying that he thinks he's winning in Texas, Florida, and Pennsylvania too, Tom. Yeah, it might be a little bit of a change, but it's subtle. I don't think the president was ever going to say, Tom, that he would call an election result if there wasn't one. That wouldn't really make sense, would it? But it does speak to the tension that is coming into this election day in the United States of America. Really, really, absolutely massive, Tom. The division between these two candidates large and the country split. But the interesting split for many of us looking at this play out is the split between the early voting that many people assume is skewed Democrat and the voting today that most people assume will be skewed Republican. And how big the Republican vote comes out today, absolutely key. To state the obvious again, Tom.
We've been showing images around the country. We welcome all of you on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television to what we hope will be really good conversation over the coming hours, including John Farrow's property at 9 a.m. on Bloomberg Television. Lisa Abramowitz, what I find extraordinary here as we actually get to polling is to see the trends beneath the presidential race. The Senate is a complete mystery, isn't it?
Yeah, although a lot of people are pricing in a blue wave or Democrats taking control. I believe the latest from 538, the election statistic blog, has it as a 75% chance of turning Democratic. What I'm looking at today, Tom, we're not necessarily going to get a result. It's going to be a nail biter for everybody on all sides. What I'm looking at is actually how the social media aspect will weigh in. I think it's been very interesting to see Twitter and Facebook try to come up with policies to insulate themselves from some of the same criticisms back in 2016, but introducing new criticisms of censorship and the like as they put warnings on different tweets. I think that's a fascinating development
I
this
was
year.
explaining 1972 to the cherubs last night, Nixon McGovern, and there was no social media at that time. What we've seen here, folks, on TV and radio is a juxtaposition of President Trump with his favorite network, Vice President Biden attending church in Delaware. We saw images of that, about 40 minutes ago. John, the view from London, is London engaged in this election?
London's always engaged. The view from London and the view from Berlin, there's always been a take that in the previous administration before this one, that President Obama had a preference for Berlin over London, Tom. And there is a conversation taking place in the city, and it has been for the last couple of months, as to whether President Biden, if we do get one, would do the same thing, whether he would move more towards Berlin and not maybe give London the treatment that this president has. This president talking up the potential of a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom, Tom. It's not clear whether Joe Biden, if he did win, would be going down the same track. Do you remember that line from President Obama? They'll be at the back of the line. That was the intervention from President Obama around 2016. Wasn't the best of friends with the UK, Tom, and you wonder if we get a repeat of that if Biden becomes the next president.
John, one more important thought. You've been way out front on the pandemic. In the last 24 hours, maybe 48 hours, we've seen not only Dr. Fauci, but Dr. Birx really go after their boss. They've made some real statements on the pandemic and its serious nature in America. Are they wearing the mask now in the United Kingdom with the grimness of this lockdown?
Yeah, they've started to, and I think we should clarify. I don't think they're necessarily going directly after their boss, but they certainly put out a point of view that is very different to what he's putting out on the campaign trail that we're turning the corner. In England, things are locking down. In France, things are locking down. In Germany, things are locking down as well. I think the more important question right now, Tom, is what happens in the United States. The UK, the Europeans clearly made mistakes, particularly the United Kingdom, on how to reopen. In the United States, many people have made the same accusation. Now we've started to see a move in Massachusetts, and I think that's really notable. And quite clearly, it's not getting the kind of coverage it would typically get because today is the election. But that's the thing for me. What happens in America and the American economy is going to be key to the cycle for the whole world.
A 10-second data check here. There's so much to talk about. Futures up 37, up more earlier. We'll take it. The VIX in a large stick, 35.83 on the VIX. Yields higher, 3 basis points to 0.87. On the 10-year, we have some dollar weakness as well. And John noting oil. West Texas, 37.90. We had a 38 handle moments ago. Michael Zezas is with us with Morgan Stanley, not only doing policy research, but with a foundational understanding of our municipal finance. We're thrilled he could join us this morning. Michael, every single conversation we have in your area says, and then there'll be infrastructure. And yet there's never infrastructure. What is the
I closed all my positions on euro at 117, okay? After calculation, you will see what profit I'll get it.
Simply put, in a divided government scenario, there's not much legislation getting done beyond perhaps another COVID relief package under certain circumstances. In a scenario where the Republicans take control of the House and keep the White House and the Senate, you have the same problem that you had in 2017 and every other time that you've had complete control by the Republican Party. In theory, they're on board with the idea of infrastructure spending. In practice, they haven't been able to get there because they also can't agree on raising taxes to do it. They are against letting the deficit expand to do it. So you end up sort of twisted up without a solution. The Democratic Party sort of is obviously a little more amenable to raising taxes or expanding deficits when it comes to spending. So again, I'd say it's a necessary condition that that's the configuration that you get. Not a sufficient one because, of course, the Democrats are going to have to balance their policy priorities, and healthcare is certainly in the mix and probably a high priority item also.
Michael, there's a lot to unpack there. I think the broader theme to all of your comments is just the risk of a divided government when it comes to fiscal spending. How big of a downside risk could there be to markets should there be a divided government? Because it does not appear that that's being priced in.
Yeah, well, so the first thing I'd say is that I think most post-election configurations here lead to fiscal expansion. The one that concerns us is the one where the Democrats take the White House, but the Republicans keep control of the Senate. And it's not to say that you might never get fiscal expansion or COVID-specific relief in that situation, but that you might need a greater demonstration from economic data or markets that such a response is needed. And that's because we know where the Democrats are on COVID relief. They want to go big. Senate Republicans are expressing skepticism that the economy needs it, are also expressing concern about raising deficits further. And so that disagreement manifests in that type of election outcome. And again, you might eventually get there, but the fiscal reaction function becomes very reactionary as opposed to proactive, which is what markets are expecting right now.
Michael, I'm really interested in the conversations you're having with clients at the moment. If you were to ask them, you think, whether they would prefer to know the outcome of the Senate race or the White House race ahead of time, what do you think they'd say?
Most clients would prefer to know the outcome of the presidential race. The consensus is still, at least in terms of the surveys that we've run, the consensus is still that a divided government outcome of any type is preferable to a unified outcome, mostly because it creates certainty around policy, or at least that's the perception, right? I obviously outlined an argument where I think it's nuanced and a little bit different.
So I do think that that is where most investors are paying their attention, but they also obviously understand the difference between the Democrats taking the White House without the Senate versus with the Senate. And generally speaking, in our surveys are agreeing that you get the biggest fiscal boost in that situation.
Mr. Zezas, the votes are in the judiciary, and I believe we have 9 justices at some point here as the clerks get ready to help Justice Coney Barrett. Great. What about the Affordable Care Act? What is the Morgan Stanley view on where the Affordable Care Act is, say, in March of 2022?
Again, I think this is very path dependent. So if we generalize a bit, not specific to the Affordable Care Act, but whether or not in 2021 you're going to have the same level of government spending on health care or greater, the situation that makes that true is the Democrats taking the White House and the Senate, regardless of what the Supreme Court outcome is, because one could expect a pretty quick response legislatively should the Supreme Court overturn the Affordable Care Act. In the situation where the Democrats take the White House, Republicans keep control of the Senate, I think that gets quite a bit trickier, and obviously it gets trickier if Republicans maintain the White House. So to the extent that you're looking for, and certainly our healthcare equity team looking at managed care organizations thinks the Affordable Care Act has largely been beneficial for the bottom line of large MCOs, the configuration that gets you the best outcome there is the Democrats winning the White House and the Senate.
Michael, appreciate your time, sir. Send our best to the team at Morgan Stanley, won't you? Michael Zezas there of Morgan Stanley. Days like today are days where typically a lot of news just slips beneath the radar. This headline does not. The Shanghai Exchange suspending Ant Group's listing on its starboard, citing an inability to fulfill conditions for listing amid changes in the regulatory environment. This coming from a statement just about 10 minutes or so ago. Lisa Abramowitz, can you speak to the regulatory tension between the Shanghai Exchange and this listing?
This is fascinating because we talk about tech regulation in the United States, but it's also going on in China, in particular with Chinese regulators going after online lenders. There are a number of new rules that have come out of China recently, particularly targeting the use of asset-backed securities to finance quick consumer loans. That's for Ant Financial, and they basically cited an inability of Ant Financial to comply with some of these rules as withdrawing this. But fascinating, John, at a time when China is talking about how it plans to or hopes to double its economy by 2035, that it's cracking down on one of its stars. It speaks to a shift in some of the policies over in that nation.
I saw that headline on doubling the economy size over the next few years. I saw that out on Twitter, Lisa Abramowitz. Oh,
did you?
With Lisa Abramowitz's Twitter account, just putting out those headlines all the time. Tom Keene, I don't know if this derails the listing in Hong Kong. Just the Shanghai one. No sign that it derails the listing in Hong Kong.
Well, that speaks to the 760 miles between Hong Kong and Shanghai. Guess what, John? It's a lot bigger divide than 760 miles. This will be fascinating. I mean, the political tension of the city-states of China, and they can speak when they have an opinion.
That's the news coming out of China. The news coming out of America is where the focus is through the next 24 hours and perhaps beyond. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. On this election day in America, this is Bloomberg Surveillance.
With the First Word News, I'm Rishika Gupta. 2 small New Hampshire communities that traditionally vote just after midnight have already tallied their ballots in the presidential election. It was a clean sweep for Joe Biden in Dixville Notch. He won the town's 5 votes. In Millsfield, a slightly larger town, President Trump won 16 of the 21 votes. In Vienna, authorities say the gunman who killed 4 people was an Austrian North Macedonian dual national who had a previous terror conviction. The suspect was killed by police, and it's not clear if he was acting alone. But police made a number of arrests in raids this morning. In addition to the fatalities, another 17 people were wounded in the attacks. Authorities say shots were fired at 6 different locations. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Rishika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome to That's Debatable, an interactive series on today's most pressing issues. The resolution this time: is a U.S.-China space race good for humanity? We'll hear from both sides.
The competition, if you look at the past, led to innovation.
A whole new arms race could start. And we'll get your perspective too, with help from the artificial intelligence of IBM Watson. I'm John Donvan. Join us for That's Debatable, presented by Bloomberg and Intelligence Squared, Friday on Bloomberg Television.
The time has come to elect the next president of the United States, and the stakes could not be higher. Two candidates, two very different paths for the future of the country. I'm David Weston. We will bring you the results as they unfold live on election night. Join us Tuesday, November 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
This will be the most important election in the history of our country. It's going to set a course. It's going to go one way or it's going to go another. And if it goes the other way, it's going to be a terrible thing. It's going to be a terrible thing. So get out there and vote.
It's time to stand up and take back this democracy. We can do this. We're better than we've been. We can be our best when we're the United States of America. God bless you all, and may God protect our troops. Go vote!
President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden at their final rallies ahead of today's election. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. For our audience worldwide, this is Bloomberg Surveillance Live on Bloomberg TV and Radio. Here's the price action Tuesday morning. Going into the main event, we advanced over the last couple of days, up another 38. We had some more weight to the S&P 500, up a little more than 1 percentage point. We've talked about that cyclical rotation beneath the surface of the index level, away from big tech towards the financials, materials, industrials. That really captured yesterday's session. In the FX market, everything stronger against the dollar in G10, euro dollar with a tidy 117 handle again, up about 0.5%, and a lot of talk about what's happening in the bond market at the moment. The curve is steeper, yields are higher, and treasuries are heading south. Yields up 2 basis points to 0.8671%. Before I go, Tom, before I wrap this one up, got to throw crude into the mix. Bouncing back after an ugly week. 37 handle on WTI, up almost 3 percentage points.
Almost back to 40 on Brent. And that percentage change, John, Dow versus NASDAQ 100 is important. It continues at this moment. Dow up 1.4%, NASDAQ up, let's call it more than half that, 0.6%. These are little nuances as well. We welcome you on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television, where we are going around the nation looking at polling places. This is an interesting polling place in Houston, Texas. This is a building of service to disabilities, the West Gray Multi-Service Center in Houston. It is part of Houston Parks and Recreation. So many of these around the country, and of course with important public services to the disabled. Polling going on there, probably at a little less. CNN, I know, reporting we're now over 100 million in, according to CNN, on total pre-voting. Right now, John Lieber joins us. He's been a good acquaintance to surveillance. He is with Eurasia Group and the U.S. Managing Director. John Lieber, an open question to you to begin. What is your number one focus as you begin to look at the mathematics of this election day?
Florida. It's going to be Florida. Florida counts quickly. Biden's ahead, but barely. I think that the early vote totals that come in tonight could show a lead for Biden, and then you'd expect to see that shift back towards Trump as the evening goes on. And if Trump wins Florida, he's competitive. But if Florida late tonight looks like it's going to go for Biden, then this race is all over, and we can all pack up our bags and get ready for the new inauguration and the transition.
John, you are calling as a House. Eurasia Group is calling for a Biden win. What do you see in the numbers that gives you that confidence, that conviction?
You know, this has just been a really steady race, and Biden's been had a polling lead despite Trump's relatively high approval ratings, given the coronavirus. Biden's had this steady polling lead since he clinched the nomination in March. And this is not like 2016, where it was an up and down race. Trump pulled within 2 to Hillary Clinton at some points. And critically, in that 2016 race, you saw an absolute collapse in the Clinton numbers over the last 10 days of that race. The 12% of undecided voters broke towards Donald Trump, and he's now the president. That's just not happening this time around. You've got a steady lead for Biden, no trend directionally suggesting that that lead is going away, and polls that show Biden competitive across the Sun Belt in all the swing states that Trump won in 2016. All Biden needs to do is win one of Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Florida, Iowa, Ohio, or Pennsylvania, and he's going to be president of the United States.
You know, Jonathan, a lot of people would say that sounds good, but 2016, we don't buy that this is so much different. And I'm looking right now at predicted measures. This is a betting markets, basically, people putting money on the election, currently pricing in about a 61% chance of Joe Biden winning versus a 44% chance of President Trump getting reelected. This is a much tighter race in prediction markets than it is in the polls and in 538 or The Economist, which puts it at a near sure thing. So what do you say to people who say that there are shy voters, that the Republicans have registered people who did not vote in the 2016 election who are likely to go for President Trump, some of these other dynamics in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the betting markets have learned humility from 2016, and that's probably appropriate. We shouldn't be too overconfident in our prediction, but there's a lot of signals here that suggest Biden's the favorite. There's very little evidence that there are shy Trump voters. There's basically one pollster out there who's pushing that and getting a lot of airtime about it, and after the election is probably going to be the go-to pollster from the Trump people to suggest that he was, in fact, robbed of this election. But he's a real outlier in the polling community. There's been numerous studies that suggest this shy Trump phenomenon and just very, very thin evidence for it. I think the polling markets are the betting markets are being a little overly cautious given the strong signal we have in all the swing states nationally and all the way down to the local level, where you're seeing that Biden seems to be having some coattails that Hillary Clinton did not, that should help Democratic candidates in this election cycle. We could be wrong again. If we were wrong, it would be the largest polling miss probably certainly in U.S. history. I mean, you'd have to be off by nearly 10 points nationally, which would be pretty absurd. And you'd have to be off between 6 and 8 points in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, which is larger than the error that we saw in 2016.
John Lieber, thank you so much with your Eurasia Group. Greatly appreciated today. A terrific essay, by the way, on the Putin outcome. What outcome of this election would Mr. Putin most like? That from Eurasia Group. See it at their website. John, images from Wisconsin. And for those on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg TV, good morning in the battleground states. John, Kevin Cirilli, mincing no words. Wisconsin will be on his late shift tonight.
A lot of voting to be done there, Tom. Coming into today, the turnout, 63% of the 2016 turnout. You compare that to Texas at 108% coming into today, and say Florida at 93%. Those are the kinds of states, Wisconsin, they are the kind of states, Tom, where we haven't seen the same kind of turnout in the early voting.
Riverside High School in Milwaukee, and of course, it's many different Wisconsins. I thought David Weigel at the Washington Post doing a great job on partitioning the states out, the difference between Milwaukee and over to Dane County and then up to Green Bay is, well, John, there's a headline from the President of the United States, and he's got a 306 handle on it.
I'm surprised he put out a number. I'm not surprised he's on with Fox, Tom, saying he thinks he's going to win. I don't think that's a shock the morning of the final day of voting. Do you?
No, Mr. Bannon out on Fox Biz early, and of course, Mr. Rove now I see over here. I've got a wall of TV monitors here, folks, mostly set up on Tottenham football in London. I'm watching like BBC 6 or BBC7, which is
what a shocker.
Tots football 24/7. I thought the Bale goal was really good the other day, John. I mean, just to, like head the ball in like that. That was really
honestly, Lisa, even on election day, he's doing this.
Look
even
at those
on election
markets.
day.
They're up.
Look at those markets. They are up for a second day going into this election. Equities advance on the S&P 500 alongside a distracted Tom Keene. Focus alongside Lisa Brown. This I'm Jonathan Ferro.
Penalty shot is, I hate penalty shots.
This is Bloomberg.
De esta manera me gustaría decirle a los empleadores que fueran más humanitarios con sus trabajadores, que les hagan valer sus derechos.
Y en la otra otras 50. En cada casa había 5 habitaciones. En cada habitación había de 3 a 4 camas abarrotadas. Vivíamos de 6 a 7 personas. Un baño para cada habitación y una cocina para todas.
Una vez que nos atendieron en el hospital, al salir nos avisó una compañera que ya nos habían reportado a migración.
Gracias a Dios ahorita de salud yo estoy muy bien, pero en lo moral no estoy muy bien, porque a causa de esa enfermedad yo perdí todo, perdí mi trabajo.
Yo creo que mi caso resulta un gran problema de cómo las personas migrantes estamos en riesgo de explotación por parte de los empleadores.
What is happening today in India is actually a determination to rebuild our economy.
India has an opportunity not only competing in the space of the factory of the world, but a very big opportunity to compete in being the office of the world.
Today is usually a little bit tedious for Wall Street, for financial market participants worldwide. You're just waiting and waiting. This market is not waiting this morning. Good morning to you all. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramovich, I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg, and here's the price action. Up 40 on the S&P. We advanced 1.2%. Gains yesterday, gains today. In the FX market, dollar weakness. Had some dollar strength last week. Quickly replaced that with weakness this Tuesday morning. Euro dollar back with a 117 handle. Talked a lot about that move in the Treasury market. Curve steeper, yields higher. Fueling some of that. Commodities get a lift. Taking a bite out of crude in yesterday's session, last week as well, though we bounced back, up 3%, almost a 38 handle, Tom, on WTI.
Yeah, it's a nice lift here again. Futures up 40, Dow futures up 400. I'm watching the VIX here. A 34 handle would be a big deal. We're not there yet. We're going to get to James Sweeney of Credit Suisse here, but first we must speak with Mark Niket. He's with Bloomberg out of Columbus, Ohio. He's really quite expert on regional politics, the corporate influence, and the study of the races underneath the presidential race. And we're thrilled he joins us from Philadelphia today, the home of the Reading Railroad. Reading is not just near Oriental and the Monopoly Board, but it is the gorgeous terminal in Philadelphia, which is now part of the Philadelphia Convention Center. It is what they did in Philadelphia after New York City destroyed Penn Station, and it is a triumph. Mark, what are you going to see in Philadelphia today? It is a hotbed. I believe various military, quasi-military have been brought out. What will you observe in Philadelphia today?
Well, you're right. There's still a National Guard presence in Philadelphia because they had some protests and some unrest last week after a black man was shot by police. But there's not going to be any kind of police presence at the polls. It's not allowed here unless there's some kind of incident. So we're going to be watching to see how long the lines are in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia, given that there was a new option for voters in Pennsylvania this year to do mail-in voting. And we saw a big surge in
voting by mail because of the pandemic here. And actually, Philadelphia and Pennsylvania are kind of running two elections at once today. They have their regular in-person voting, but they're also counting and starting to process this flood of mail-in ballots.
Mark, Philadelphia and Pennsylvania more broadly, pivotal for the election's outcome. We may not know the result in that state for days or even weeks. Why?
Well, it's because of these mail-in ballots. Pennsylvania is one of the only states that doesn't allow the election clerks to start actually physically opening the envelopes, flattening the ballots, and scanning them until 7 a.m. on election day today. Wisconsin also doesn't allow that, and Michigan there's some time. But states like Florida can start 22 days before the election, so they'll have most of their mail-in and absentee ballots counted on election night. But here in Pennsylvania, they're expecting it could take days in Philadelphia and maybe some other places as well before they get a final count on all the absentee and mail-in ballots. They can just start counting today.
Hey, Mark, really appreciate your time this morning, sir. Good luck for the rest of the day. Mark Niquette there, Bloomberg's very own, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. From London and New York this morning, good morning. Quick check on a price action, just briefly. Equities with a lift. We're off session highs, but we advance. 42 on the S&P 500. Tom, we are up by 1.27% this Tuesday.
Absolutely. Again, futures up 42. Right now, James Sweeney joins us with Credit Suisse, and this is an important conversation because in the mix of the political punditry and, frankly, the financial punditry, Mr. Sweeney has been very clear of a cautious view on American economic growth. James, you still continue with the view that it will be a struggle forward?
Well, I think it largely depends on the stimulus outlook. And so, you know, what I'll be looking for today is, do we get a clean sweep scenario where the stimulus expectations become clear, or do you have something a lot more muddled? I think effectively what's happened in recent months is that the big increase in deposit balances of a lot of households and the fact that people have bought a lot of physical goods while they haven't been buying a lot of services has hidden some problems that the household sector has with cash flows if we don't get that stimulus. There are quite a few things that are going to restrict household cash flows and incomes in the months ahead without new help from the government.
James, when you say problems, can you be more specific about those problems and where you think they are?
Sure. Well, first, you remember the unemployment insurance, which we had supplementary unemployment insurance during the worst part of the pandemic. It expired in August. People said there would be a cliff. There was a cliff. It fell. But there's another cliff at the end of December. So there's more, basically unemployment payments from the government will be reduced further. There's also forbearance measures that many households have benefited from, which will expire at the end of the year. If you look at labor income, it's very unlikely we're going to continue to see 600 to 1 million in jobs growth per month. So jobs growth should be good, but it should continue to slow. Wage growth should slow because wage growth has been driven up by an odd composition effect in the jobs data. And the hours worked per week should slow due to a similar effect. So if you're in the nerdy details, a lot of them point south in the near term in terms of the cash flows of households.
James, I've got to say, you just don't sound as constructive as you were maybe a month or so ago on this recovery. Is that a fair characterization of your development of your ideas in the last month or so?
Well, I think I just see it as very stimulus dependent in the near term. I mean, recently we are in a little bit of a slowdown relative to the sharp acceleration that we had in Q3, but the economy is not contracting. The economy is growing right now. But I do think stimulus in the very short term, something like the package that was negotiated between July and this month, is very important. And so, you know, if you have an election outcome that makes that stimulus likely, then I think we can be in pretty good shape. But otherwise, I think there's trouble. Also, the virus. I mean, the virus is picking up again, and that's a new headwind. And the virus is probably picking up a little more than a lot of people expected. So we're just skittish, I would say, rather than actually forecasting a major problem.
James, that's where I wanted to go, the virus and how much it's spreading. What high-frequency data are you looking at to gauge the response? If it isn't lockdowns, as a lot of people expect the U.S. to avoid some of the lockdowns that we're seeing in Europe, what are the measures you're looking at to determine how much people's behavior is sort of acting in a restrictive way on the economy?
Well, sure. So, I mean, on the virus side, we just look at the positivity rates and the spread and, you know, the direct virus data. On the economy side, I think a lot of this new data that we have on foot traffic to establishments, on point of sales data, I don't think the macro data are all that helpful. And I think the market is somewhat accustomed to looking at the same old indicators, but it can get thrown off pretty easily. So, for instance, people have been excited about retail sales being strong. Retail sales are goods consumption. Consumption is 70% of GDP, but only 20% of that is actually goods. Services are the problem here. So looking at foot traffic into restaurants, foot traffic into airports, things like that,
right.
And related spending numbers are what we're watching.
James Sweeney, Jean-Claude Trichet loves the word diffusion, except he says it with a fancy French accent I don't have. And right now, the major question is, if we have the haves doing better or even prospering in this pandemic, can any of their prosperity diffuse over to a large body of Americans who are, to be kind, economically anxious? Is there any ability to see a diffusement of that prosperity, that income, that wealth?
Well, the problem isn't just that the income trends are different, but the concentration of people working in lower wage services sectors while having lost their unemployment or their extra unemployment and, you know, about to potentially be losing their forbearance, that's trouble. So the fact that people are buying big ticket durable goods, largely imported, are not necessarily helpful, you know, to a waitress who isn't working right now.
James, great to catch up with you, sir. James Sweeney there of Credit Suisse. I want to bring you some more breaking news just very quickly. Earlier on today, about an hour ago, we found out that there has been some tension between the Shanghai Stock Exchange and the listing of Ant Financial. So much tension, in fact, over regulatory issues that Ant Financial's listing will not be going ahead on that particular exchange. Now understanding that the Hong Kong exchange is set to make an announcement on Ant's Hong Kong listing. This according to Business News. That's a report at the moment. Lisa, remarkable turn of events in just the past 60 minutes alone.
Yeah, I got to say, this is fascinating, again, because we talk about tech regulation in the U.S., not so much in China, but they are cracking down, particularly on the financial sector, trying to make some of the online lenders hold more capital and perhaps not as easily raise money through asset-backed securities to finance consumer loans. There is a fear of stoking, perhaps, financial unrest should there be some instability in the financial system. And, John, just to put this into context, this $34.5 billion IPO, the world's largest, what was set to start trading on Thursday, had $3 trillion of retail bids, of retail demand coming in. This was going to be incredibly hot among the rank and file in China, a high button issue. Interesting to see what actually transpired in some of these meetings.
So this could go one of two ways, I guess, Tom. Either you recalibrate the listing in Hong Kong, you go bigger there, you adjust things, or the whole thing gets pulled. I think probably people leaning towards the former and not the latter at the moment.
Yeah, what I would partition here, John, is the idea of a financial calculus. Okay, the price, the shares, we want a piece of the action in that. Or is it more about an unrest over the structural calculus? This headline from the Global Times, Ant Group to readjust listed businesses' valuation. I get the valuation part, that's sort of Wall Streety. But the listed businesses to readjust, John, is this about a strategic structure or is it simply about a financial pricing? I don't know.
I don't know either. I'm looking for the clarity. Alibaba, though, is falling in the pre-market by as much as 6.7% at the moment. Down and down hard. Alongside Lisa Rabbit and Tom Keene, I'm Jonathan Ferro this morning. Good morning. It is election day. We have a rally for you going into this one. A rally yesterday. Monday into Tuesday, it continues. A lift in this equity market, up 40, up 1.21%. In the FX market, a euro with a 117 handle. And in the bond market, yields up, curve steeper, crude rallying. It's Risk on Tuesday on this election day in America. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
With the First Word News, I'm Ritika Gupta. President Trump and Joe Biden have brought their bitter campaign to an end. They spent the final day rallying support in states crucial to deciding the outcome. Almost 100 million Americans have already voted. Biden is seen to have the upper hand with leads in national and most swing state polls. President Trump's counting on heavy turnout by his supporters today. A federal appeals court has denied a request by Texas Republicans to ban drive-through voting today in the state's most populous county. The Republicans said they wanted to prevent election violations. The court denied the request without an explanation. And reported coronavirus cases have hit an all-time high in the U.S., and hospitalizations have risen in 44 states. Battleground states in the elections are facing their worst moments of the pandemic. Wisconsin posted America's third highest cases per capita in the past week. 7-day average cases are at records in Michigan and Iowa. Hurricane Eta has strengthened into one of the Atlantic's most powerful storms of the year. It's roaring towards Central America with winds of 150 miles an hour. The Category 4 storm is expected to cause flash floods and life-threatening storm surges when it slams into Nicaragua today. And Apple will start to end its 15-year relationship with Intel next week. That's when new Mac computers are revealed. These Macs will have main processors designed by Apple for the first time. They'll replace Intel chips, which have been a mainstay since 2006. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Women leaders were actually better at controlling the deaths from COVID-19. Do you think out of this pandemic, we'll see more countries be willing to elect female leaders?
When we look at women leaders, we tend to project on them baggage that they shouldn't bear.
Women are given an opportunity when no one else wants to do the job.
Women had a very clear objective. They wanted to save lives.
The women leaders, if you look at their careers, have also built up a level of trust.
In fact, women have to be better at communication in order to be elected as leaders, whereas this doesn't hold true for men.
We need to get those sexist stereotypes out of our head and give women a fair run for leadership.
Trying to change the stereotypes about women is not only the business of women, but men have to be part of it.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
CPG history, their experience, and really how we might be able to combine together to really create this fantastic public company. And so we kind of got into the SPAC thing a little bit before it became such a hot method of going public.
All right, so we're going to mass distribute the vaccine in just a few short weeks. It's going to be coming out very soon, and we will quickly eradicate the virus, wipe out the China plague once and for all, get it the hell out of here.
Last night, Trump went on to say he was going to fire Dr. Fauci. Well, I've got a better idea. Let's fire Trump and I'll hire Fauci.
President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden at their final rallies ahead of today's election. Today, a good day maybe to bury some news. This coming on Ant Financial. About an hour ago, the Shanghai Exchange suspended Ant Group's listing on its starboard. The Ant Group now saying that Hong Kong and that IPO has also been suspended. Alibaba, which owns about a third of the payments company, is getting absolutely hammered in early trading now. Down as much as 9%, off by about 8.5%, Tom, in pre-market trading. Most mornings, this would probably be the story. This morning, of course, the story is something else worldwide. But this is big.
Yeah, it's big. There's no question about it, and it speaks much to the future of stock formation, equity formation on the Pacific Rim. It was certainly, John, an original transaction. John, you wonder how the domestic politics of America folds into this, the China view of Trump, the China view of Biden. What do you think, John Farrell?
Well, I think on that specific question, Tom, it's pretty clear. This market has already decided that the China view of Biden is much softer than the China view of Trump. And you've seen that in the trade around the Chinese currency and some of the calls we've had in the last month or so. The election coverage will continue. I'll step away. Coming up on the Open, I'll catch up with Priya Misra of TD Securities. I'll be catching up with Troy Gajewski of Skybridge as well. Looking forward to those conversations through the next hour, Tom, on Bloomberg TV.
Very good. Right now on Bloomberg Radio and Good Morning 106.1 up in Boston. Greatly appreciate your attendance this morning on Bloomberg Television. I would suggest the most important political conversation of the day. Marty Walsh is from Boston, but is a different path than anybody else I know. The gentleman who fought off cancer as a child, went to BC, and then he had to root for the New England Patriots. He appears with us today, even though the Patriots are not the Patriots he and I know, and even though Brady did better than good last night. Marty Walsh, it is a Boston in transition. Clearly, you are for President Biden. What do the cities need from a Biden administration day one?
The collaboration, I think, is the first thing that we need the most. Myself and Mayor Lance Bottoms from Atlanta just did an op-ed, and we talked about the importance of having a White House that understands how a city works and understands the relationships that need to happen. And in the last 3.5 years, I've had no meetings, no conversations with the White House. The White House, the way it currently exists, is a top-down approach, and the Joe Biden White House would be very different.
Mayor Walsh, Christopher Whalen, a good friend of the show, an expert in financial history, just put out a photo on Twitter on Central Park South. And it's from the Trump campaign. New Yorkers are going to suffer, and that's their problem. That's been the attitude of this president towards Democratic strongholds, and yet we see Republican cities as well having challenges in the pandemic. How much do you need from Washington, and what will you do with the money when you get it?
Well, when it comes to mayors don't regard each other as Democrats or Republicans. We regard each other as mayors that run our cities, and we collectively need to have an administration in Washington that's going to work with us. And I can say firsthand here in Boston, from the early days of the pandemic, right through the pandemic, there's been no assistance from Washington. We've had to go it alone for the most part, including states. We've had to figure out PPE. We've had to figure out even thinking about how do we prepare our residents for the future as far as being careful and physical distancing and social distancing. Our messages have been consistent across America. It's really important. And then as racism reared its ugly head in America again, and we had protests and demonstrations across the streets, around the streets in America, this White House, quite honestly, just agitated and incited violence And it's really, we need leadership right now. And in Boston, I'll tell you, 159,000 people have already voted before Election Day. So there is definitely a feel for change in the air. And it's not just Democratic cities, it's all cities across America.
Mayor Walsh, there is a feeling of change. There's also a feeling of fear. And my younger son last night said to me, you know, is there going to be violence? And he's looking around and he's seeing all of the boarded up windows around New York City, and I believe in Boston as well, your town. How concerned are you about violence in response to any election outcome, particularly if President Trump is in the lead, given the fact that people in Democratic cities are the ones, honestly, that are having boarded up windows?
Just think about the question you just asked me. We live in the greatest country in the world, where freedom and democracy is what we're proud of. And we have cities and businesses all across America putting boards on windows, worrying about violence because of a general election. We've never seen anything like that. This is not a result of Joe Biden and his speeches. This is a result of a president who has failed America. This is a result of a president who's failed the American economy. He's failed everything that he claims he stands for. And I'm hoping that after today's election, we don't see violence. And what I'm focused on today is making sure that people get out to vote. People can vote without intimidation. People can vote safely. And they should be able to do that in Boston, Massachusetts, and they should be able to do that all across America today without that fear. I hope that's not the country that we're becoming, quite honestly.
Mayor Walsh, one final question, if we would, this morning. Dorchester represents the heritage of a Democratic Party that has lost so many people to the Republicans, or at least to Donald Trump. What is the policy prescription you would suggest for the liberals in your party to get back to the kind of voters that made Dorchester years ago?
I think first and foremost, we need to elect Joe Biden president today. And I think that then we go back and to kind of look at the party and not, I would say we have to rebuild the Democratic Party, but certainly we have to go back and get those Democrats that used to be Democrats and pull them back into the Democratic Party. The values of the Democratic Party are the same values that those people, the party they joined many, many years ago. And as mayor of the city of Boston, I'm committed to doing that. And as other mayors across America, we're committed to bringing our party back and representing everyone.
Mayor Walsh, I'd like to see you at Tom English's pub, but I believe it shut down a year ago.
Oh, there's still one in Southie.
There's still one in Southie. That's all that matters. Mayor, thank you so much. Marty Walsh, the mayor of Boston, here on a most interesting day. And again, we say good morning to Bloomberg Radio, listening across New England, 106.1 FM. Lisa, an eventful morning, including the vice president, I believe, traveling to Scranton.
Yeah, and I think that the imagery is going to be really telling. I keep coming back to that. Both candidates want to display a sense of victory, even though we're not going to necessarily know what victory means for days to come, Tom. This is going to be a very unusual election week, election month, election year. You want to keep going on?
Well, maybe it's going to be a permanent election. I believe on Wednesday, Lisa, we start the campaign for the primary season of 2022.
It already started.
We've had great images today, and thank you to Kevin Cirilli, his focus on Wisconsin, and of course on his Pennsylvania. Philadelphia at the Convention Center in Pennsylvania, front and center, part of the two big city, Pennsylvania. Kevin Cirilli focused on Erie. Stay with us through the day, this election day, across America. This is Bloomberg.
time has come to elect the next president of the United States, and the stakes could not be higher. Two candidates, two very different paths for the future of the country. I'm David Weston. We will bring you the results as they unfold live on election night. Join us Tuesday, November 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
From London and New York, for our audience worldwide, good morning, good morning. The countdown to the open starts right now. With equity futures up 36, we advance 1%, 30 minutes away from the opening bell. We begin with a big issue. It's election day in America.
4 years ago, I was going to lose all nine. It was going to be a very short evening. And I won all nine. I won them all.
You put an end to a president that's divided this nation.
He's not mentally equipped. He just doesn't to be your president.
We're going to win Pennsylvania, and we're going to show the world what America stands for.
We win Pennsylvania, we win the whole deal.
We're in a home stretch now. It's go time.
We are going to keep on winning, winning, winning.
It's time for Donald Trump to pack his bags and go home.
Biden would be a disaster.
I got a better idea. Let's fire Trump.
You have the power with your vote to save America.
The candidates concluding their last-minute campaigning blitz, and now it's all up to the American public with a record-shattering 98 million early ballots already in hand. The final polling favoring former Vice President Joe Biden, leading by nearly 7 points in the latest national average survey. The world waiting to see who will lead the United States for the next 4 years, with the first results rolling in around 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Let's bring in the Bloomberg team. Kevin Cirilli and Katie Lyons joining us now for more. Kevin, let's start with you, sir. The guidebook, the playbook for the next 24 hours and maybe beyond.
Well, here's what we know, that likely we will not have the results of some close states. If it's a close result in states like North Carolina and Pennsylvania, and dare I say even Florida. If it's a close election, we might have to be patient and hold our breath. But in a battleground state like Wisconsin, for example, the Democratic governor there, Tony Evers, has said that he actually does think that there could be a result in that state, mind you, in the early hours of tomorrow morning. Beyond that, Joe Biden, he will be traveling to Scranton, Pennsylvania today, where he grew up. He started the day by attending Mass with his family. And President Trump starting the day on Fox and Friends. And take a listen to what he had to say about how he views today.
I think we'll have victory, but only when there's victory. I mean, there's no reason to play games. And I think we'll have victory. I think I look at it as being a very, a very solid chance at winning here.
Beyond that, we're also going to be carefully tracking the Senate race. I keep going back to this point, Jonathan, but it does bear repeating. Last cycle, there were 34 Senate races, and all 34 of those races voted with the top of the ticket, in the sense that in states Trump won, the Republican Senate candidate won, and in states that Clinton won, the Democratic candidate won. So the battle for the Senate really could have a huge impact in terms of how whomever wins the presidency is able to govern.
Kevin, I'm going to let you run because I know you've got to have a little nap ahead of tonight's coverage. We appreciate your time, sir, as always. Kevin Cirilli, looking forward to the reporting a little bit later this evening into the overnight period. And then, of course, in the morning as well, Kevin will still be awake running through those results for us. On this market, a really nice cyclical tilt to the equity market action over the last 24 hours. It continues into this morning. Futures up 38 on the S&P 500 with the market action. Here's Kaylee. Hey, Kaylee.
Hey, John. Well, equities are staging some kind of election day rally here. Futures pointing to a higher open, following on from the gains we're seeing in the European session. As you said, S&P futures up around 38 points, and it is the NASDAQ that is the relative laggard once again. A cyclical rotation showing up beneath the surface, perhaps bets that it will be a Democratic sweep and more fiscal stimulus is coming that would benefit some of those more economically sensitive sectors. And you can see that as well in the outperformance of small caps. Russell 2000 futures higher by about 1.7%. with about 27 minutes to go until the opening bell. And when you look cross-asset Actually, no, John, treasuries are behaving the way that one would expect them to, with the risk-on tone today. The 10-year yield is up around 3 points, printing about 87 basis points on that yield right now. The yield curve is steepening this morning, John. And you're also seeing a weaker dollar, weaker by about 0.6%. It's down against everything in the G10 space. And interestingly, oil benefiting perhaps from that risk-on tone, up about 3.5%, a 38 handle on WTI once again. We just saw, though, gold on that board, John, getting a bit of a bid today. That may just be because of the weaker dollar, but it also could indicate there is still some hedging going on against any kind of election uncertainty. And you're actually seeing that uncertainty and that fear about...
I'm placing a new order to sell short Swiss franc at 0.91.5. Okay. Okay. Yep, order placed.
Kelly Lights, thank you. Elevated volatility and persistently elevated volatility over the last several months has been a key feature of this market worldwide. Going into the opening bow, 25 minutes away, equities do advance up 39. We advance a little more than 1%. Henrietta Trays of Vader Partners seeing less potential for another surprising Trump victory. She goes on to say the following. In 2016, President Trump won the election in a very different environment than the one he faces today. When he has high turnout at this rate, the chips don't have an opportunity to fall in Trump's favor in the same way they did in 2016. He has not attracted new voters to his fold. Henrietta, I'm pleased to say, joins us now. Henrietta, fantastic to have you with us on election day. Thank you for your time. Let's start there. The high voter turnout that we've already seen over the last month in this country. So many people say it's all about turnout, but they've failed to tell us what this turnout actually means, Henrietta. What's your read?
I've been reading through the numbers this morning with the latest polling data, and what it looks like to me, based on what we've seen in this massive surge of early voting, is that one of the biggest surprises that 30% of the voters are new voters. 36% of that group is unmarried women. And that is a group, along with the younger demographic, that skews dramatically in favor of the Democratic conference. You can't say for certain because we don't know how these people have voted, obviously, and a lot of them are classifying as independents. But if you run with a 52%, just a bare minimum average of independent voters trending into the Democratic space and supporting Biden over Trump, you are looking at the early returns suggesting a very strong showing for Biden in Arizona. Very strong for Biden in North Carolina. So much showing in Nevada that local prognosticators there feel comfortable having already speculated that the race will be won by Joe Biden as of yesterday morning. And weaker than expected showing in Pennsylvania. Florida is very much on the cusp, but the early voting suggests that there is a dramatic increase in younger voters, first-time voters, and those under 29, which skew sometimes 26 points in Joe Biden's favor. So the data sets that we've gotten so far are obviously, we are going to have maybe 60 million people still to vote, and we don't know exactly how those voters turned out, but right now it looks very strong for Joe Biden, which is very consistent with what we've seen for the last year.
Henrietta, talk to me about momentum. A key feature of the 2016 race going into the final week was a real pickup in momentum for President Donald Trump. I wonder if you're seeing any of that anywhere, not just at the state level in battlegrounds, but also in key demographics, the over 65s, suburban women, etc. Do you see any momentum anywhere, Henrietta?
What's so interesting about that is that there's been something going around the street suggesting that October 31st data from 2016 is somehow comparable to October 31st data in 2020. And there could be this dramatic shift and surprise for Trump in the polls in the last 8 or 9 days of the election. What that fails to capture is that the Comey letter came out on the 28th. Dramatically shifted voter opinion. There were 12.5% of voters that were undecided and broke late to Trump. And the difference between 2016 and 2020 is that the election's on November 3rd, not in the following week as it was in 2016. So there's less time. Too many votes have already factored in, and we did not see a material move for Donald Trump in the polls in the late-breaking way, the way it did in 2016. So this idea of tremendous uncertainty, I think, is manufactured in part by the Trump campaign itself, trying to remind voters of how successful it was unexpectedly in 2016. But that same environment has not repeated itself this year.
So, Henrietta, you've got your base case, you've got your forecast. Now let's talk about the process through the night as things develop. What are you looking for that will validate your forecast or lead you to question it?
Well, I want to see Nevada. That was a very big deal in 2016. I do think that that will swing in Biden's favor. So that gives me some comfort that there's not a polling surprise to come. North Carolina is going to start reporting out its findings at 7:30, as are a couple of other states. And I anticipate that we could have a conclusion here before too late in the evening. A lot of races and the big ones were called around 10:30 in 2016. And given the sheer volume of early voting and the potential for a lot of these states to have started counting already, including in Arizona, including in Florida, you could have some real data to run with just based off of that early voting. There will be a bit of a tide. It could come in strong for Biden early, and then as the hours go by, trend in the President Trump's favor, because the in-person voting right now has to be heavily Republican because they are lagging so substantially behind Democrats at this point. So there will be a bit of a tide throughout the evening. But as Kevin was mentioning before, Wisconsin anticipates having all of its reporting in by 6 a.m. tomorrow. So we should have a good idea. I don't buy into the narrative that this is going to be particularly contested.
Henrietta, great to catch up with you. Appreciate that perspective. Henrietta Trey's there, weighing in on the situation for the election through the next 24 hours. And contrary to some of the fears out there, believing that we will have a result before Wednesday morning. Let's get to the price action. Equities up 40 points at the S&P 500. We advanced 1.2% at the market desk with your movers. Here's Abigail.
John, well, with the second day of a rebound rally for stocks and the Dow and the S&P 500 outperforming the NASDAQ, not surprisingly, we do have the cyclical tilt that you have been alluding to. Now, that means that we have energy up top. Well, yesterday up top, up about 3.7% on the day. Yesterday, the best sector. Today, we once again have the oil majors sharply higher, in sympathy with oil, up about 3.3%. The banks are doing well, as they did yesterday. Today, Bank of America, as an example, up 1.9% in sympathy today. This was not the case yesterday. Yields are rising as bonds sell off. And then there's tech. Overall, tech is underperforming, and really standing out is Alibaba, really getting clobbered. This, of course, after Ant Group has suspended its Hong Kong and Shanghai IPOs on regulatory issues. Jack Ma's empire struggling this morning, John.
Abigail, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Going into the opening bell, equities advancing. I show you a poll, and you all say, I don't buy it. It's a market condition by 2016, refusing to believe what's in the numbers. That conversation coming up next with Troy Gayeski of Skybridge. From London and New York this morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg.
Short position open at 0.915. At short position on Swiss franc.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan. We did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
We're looking at an election that favors a Democratic sweep.
What's really also priced in is the Biden trade, right? The blue wave.
But it's definitely not fully convincing and conclusive.
If it goes wrong, you could get a huge sell-off.
We're wary at the moment in markets.
The margins have been narrowing somewhat.
A lot of people were caught very flat-footed in 2016.
Definitely what we've learned is not to count Trump out.
The scars of 2016 still deep. The national poll showing former Vice President Joe Biden holding a strong advantage, but markets pricing in a much closer outcome. Bloomberg's Scarlett Fu joins us now for more. Hey, Scarlett.
Hi, John. Yeah, you're absolutely right. We make the distinction because 2016 was such a shocker, defying most of the polls out there. Now, President Trump may be trailing in most polls, but he can take some comfort from certain polls. Bloomberg Opinion's John Authors included a couple of charts in his column this morning. You have database models, which include aggregates of different polls out there. So according to, say, 538 and the Economist models, Biden's odds of winning are at least 90%. You also have market-based models where people wager real money to buy futures or place spread bets tied to the outcome. And in the predicted model, you can see that Biden still prevails, but his odds drop to about 2 and 3. Real Clear Politics aggregates the spread betting models. And once again, in that situation, Joe Biden is leading, but by the same margin, around 2 out of 3 odds. Now, the bottom line here is that database models reflect what people say, or at least what they tell pollsters, while market-based models reflect where people actually put their money. So the question really becomes, do the markets, which reflect higher odds of a Trump victory, see something that polls and modelers don't? The problem is the sample size in election prediction markets is fairly small. These are not deep and liquid markets like traditional financial markets are. You also can't read the intent behind a specific wager, which could be a hedge rather than a directional bet. And of course, complicating all of this, John, is that you had a surge in early voting this year, either in person or by mail. Some 100 million people have already cast their ballots. So to get a read on what's been happening and what's going to happen is very difficult. John?
Scarlett, great to catch up. As always, Scarlett Fu on this market, on the consensus going into another election. 4 years ago, what was amazing about that specific time wasn't just about the outcome. The outcome was unexpected. It was the outcome of the outcome. What a Donald Trump presidency would mean for this market. How many people lined up on programs like this saying equities would crash? And then they didn't. And one question that I asked earlier today, and I think it's a really important question to ask yourself today as we all sit here and speculate what all these different permutations mean. If I told you 4 years ago what the result of that election would be 24 hours later, would you have put on the right trade? I've asked that question a few times this morning, and so many people have got in touch with me and just said no. So think about that this morning. 14 minutes out from the opening bell, futures up 38. We advance 1%. Skybridge's Troy Gajewski weighing in on the market's potential reaction to the election. He says the following: the question now is whether we get the blue wave and massive fiscal stimulus early next year, followed by higher taxes, as well as a re-regulatory agenda. In the near term, election outcome certainty and stimulus trump longer-term policy changes. Troy joins us right now. Troy, let's start with that question 4 years ago. If I gave you the result, would you have got the trade right?
Well, not in the first 2 or 3 days. You know, we were certainly in the camp that if Trump won, you would have a sell-off that lasted several days, and instead it lasted, you know, basically shortly for 4 hours in overnight futures. And then markets very rapidly started to price in a pro-growth agenda, you know, steeper yield curve, deregulation. You know, the banks really ripped after that, as well as energy. So we would have gotten it right, but we would have been a couple days late, right? And so we took our time to analyze, you know, what the policies meant, and that's when we started to ramp up our bank credit exposure at the time, because it was so much more of a favorable environment, not only in terms of higher interest rates, but also a steeper yield curve and clearly a deregulatory agenda, which particularly benefited banks and bank credit at that time.
So, Troy, let's talk about lessons learned and whether they're lessons you would apply to the next 24, 48 hours.
Yeah, so look, I think the bottom line is the probability of a Biden win is materially higher than the probability of a Clinton win. At that point, it was 3 and 4. You know, so Trump had a 1 in 4 chance roughly, which basically tracked what Nate Silver was predicting. And the odds markets were a little bit higher probability for Trump at the time, around 40%. You know, this time around, it's just a harder lift, as your previous guest articulated. You know, there's been so much early voting. You know, Trump doesn't have as much time to close the gap. You know, in most of the swing states, he's trailing by higher margins. And people forget it's just really hard for a Republican to win. You have to win Florida, North Carolina. You have to run up the score in Ohio to have any chance in Pennsylvania. And if you don't win Pennsylvania, very hard to see how you win Michigan. So, the odds are we see a blue wave. The Senate's 50-50 or maybe 49-51. And that in turn will lead to significant fiscal policy stimulus, which, it's a shame we haven't gotten so far. And from our perspective, markets have been pricing this in the past 3 weeks. I mean, you look at large cap tech, which peaked in early September. Banks had been getting clobbered for quite some time. They've come back. Cyclicals have come back. You've seen a steeper yield curve. And really the last straw today is the dollar getting trashed, because that's been the expectation for quite some time, with even larger deficits being run and more stimulus in the near term. The dollar has been hanging in there relatively well given the resurgence of the pandemic, but you see the dollar finally getting hit pretty hard today.
See that more pronounced today and yesterday in the equity market. Big tech underperforming, that cyclical rotation, the curve steeper, yields higher. Talking about the dollar this morning, weaker against pretty much everything in G10, everything on top of the US dollar, with the exception of maybe the Turkish lira over the last couple of days. We can talk about that later. Troy, my question to you, sir, is that I can sit here and construct a bullish narrative on a blue wave. I can sit here and construct a bearish narrative on a blue wave. How difficult is it to understand how that consensus will develop in the coming days, if indeed that is even the result?
Oh, yeah. No, it's certainly very challenging. I mean, not only lining up the outcomes, but also the timing. From our perspective, in the nearer term, as we said, the additional stimulus plus the certainty of outcome, meaning there's not going to be a contested election, right? Because that's a very big risk factor now, that the race is tight enough and Pennsylvania turns into an absolute mess, and that could lead to a more material risk off. But barring that outcome, if you get the blue wave, in the shorter term, meaning the next several months, even into February and March, we should have a meaningful trade up in all risk assets. Dollar should weaken, curve should continue to steepen. We may or may not see further sector rotation because of the fact we've already seen quite a large amount of that so far. And then at that point, markets are going to have to digest, okay, corporate taxes are going up, we know that, but when is it going to be? Is it going to be Q2 of next year? Or is it going to be Q4 of next year? We think that just like the Obama administration held off on raising taxes for several years to get the economy back on its feet, that prudence will prevail and the party will delay that. And then obviously you have the re-regulatory agenda, which will be very painful for certain sectors like, oil and gas, but on the broader economy should not be as destructive as many people fear.
Well, let's talk about the broader economy away from the politics and trying to game what's going to happen in the next 48 hours and trying to game what it actually means. My colleague Mark Cudmore, running for Bloomberg today, just about how important the trend was going into 2017 for the global economy. That synchronized global growth didn't come from just the US election. It was much more than that. And Troy, this morning, we caught up Chris Verone of Strategas, who was talking about a similar thing. Stick with what's working. Stick with the trend. That's the story here. Troy, does that speak to you? Stick with what's working.
Well, look, again, what worked earlier in the year coming out of the pandemic was mainly large cap tech, and that's lagged recently. However, over the longer term, technology and healthcare in particular are sectors that have tremendous growth, so we don't know why people wouldn't want to have some exposure there. You certainly don't rotate a dramatic amount of your risk away from, growth areas to value based on a rotation that may or may not have happened already. More critically, back to your point, you did have synchronized growth going into 17 that was starting to pick up, and Europe was just about to go on its best growth spurt since really the pre-crisis period. It's really hard to see that now. But coming back to the U.S. economy directly, look, due to fiscal stimulus, due to massive Fed intervention, GDP is only 3.5% below where it was in Q4 of 19. If we get a big round of stimulus, it seems highly likely that we're going to be back to peak GDP by the end of Q2. Now, that doesn't mean we still won't have losers in the economy like airlines and lodging. But on the flip side, if we can get back to peak GDP by the end of Q2, that sets us up to have, pretty powerful growth through the end of 2021 into 2022, which we think will be a more dominant factor in driving markets than a re-regulatory agenda or marginally higher tax rates.
Troy, we've got to leave it there. I'll ping you a message in the morning to talk markets. Great to catch up, sir. Troy Gajewski there at Skybridge. Up next on this programme, the analyst action you need to know. That'll be next in your morning calls. Then later, for this market, is it really just a blue wave or bust? We'll ask Stifel's Barry Bannister at the opening bell. This is Bloomberg.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
Here are the morning calls. First up, Citi raising its alphabet price target to 2,000. The analyst citing broad-based strength in YouTube and search. Secondly, Morgan Stanley upgrading Monster Beverage to overweight. The analyst expecting a re-acceleration in domestic sales. And finally, Argus downgrading Hess to a hold. The analyst citing concerns over the company's debt and mounting losses. Three of the calls this morning. Up next on the program, the election, challenging investors, trying to find the narrative.
Ada 3 kelompok pengungsi tersebut yang sudah berpencar arah. Kemudian kami dari Polsek Banda Sakti berkoordinasi dengan perangkat desa Kampung Jomblang melakukan upaya pengumpulan secara persuasif serta minta tolong kepada warga. Alhamdulillah warga yang terpecah semuanya berkumpul.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm placing a stop on profit for Swiss franc at 0.9146. Oh, actually, no, I will wait a little bit. I will place a stop on profit 0.9148. Okay?
Electioneering series. Tune in 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific, only on Bloomberg Television.
I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
So here we are. Usually days like today are a little bit of a snooze. You wait, and then you wait, and then you stay up overnight, and maybe you trade. Today we have a lift, a real rally that follows through from yesterday, a real cyclical tilt to that rally too. The S&P 500 outperforming, the Nasdaq underperforming, up 0.7% on Nasdaq futures. On S&P 500 futures up 36, we advance 1%. It is election day in America. Switch up the board in the bond market. Treasuries selling off, yields are higher, the curve is steeper, up 3 basis points on a 10-year to 0.8739%. Troy Gayeski of Skybridge on the program 10 minutes ago talking about the dollar getting trashed. It's getting hit pretty badly in G10. Euro-dollar 117.20, up 0.7%. And there it is. Not enough chat about this. The bounce back in crude, up a little more than 3.5% on the day. 38 handle on WTI, worth a look, a real cyclical lift to this market in the last couple of days going into the final day of voting in America. So that's the cross-asset price action. Let's get to the market desk with your movers. Here's Abigail.
John, with the underperformance for the NASDAQ on this morning, higher but up less than both the Dow and the S&P 500. Let's start there with technology. Now, Twitter today is actually getting a bid, the first time in 3 days. The last 2 days down 24%, the worst 2 days going back to July of 2018 on those disappointing earnings results. But today up 1.8%, and yesterday the company saying that it will not allow the presidential candidates to claim victory for themselves. Apple also getting a small bid, up 0.4%. However, where we have some real weakness, PayPal down 6%. They beat earnings estimates, but the revenue guidance disappointing, so that stock getting punished, and Alibaba down sharply.
Moving further, my stop on profit for Swissy to 91.46. Okay, 0.9146.
A bid on that rally for oil you were talking about. Boeing, the industrial company, up 1.8%, and that is the second best sector right here on the open. The best sector, though, John, as you know, the financials up 1.9%. JP Morgan up 3.5%. This as the yield curve is steepening on election day, John.
A lift for the banks off the back of that bond market move. Abigail, thank you. About 2 minutes into this session, we advanced a little more than 1% on the S&P 500. Bottom of the pile, near bottom of the pile, is big tech. You see that reflected in the NASDAQ, underperforming the S&P 500. Financials, as Abigail points out, up by 1.9%. Industrials, up by 1.7%. 2 months ago, if we talked about a blue wave, I would have had guests on this program talking about how bearish that would be for this market. Over the last month or so, you talk about a blue wave and everyone's lining up to tell you how bullish it is for this equity market. Wall Street is warming up to the idea of a blue wave. Invesco's Alessio De Longo is expecting it to fuel the next leg of growth.
If indeed we get a blue wave, if we can get a material expectation for large infrastructure spending, I think that can change the equation for growth expectations in the U.S.
Let's bring in Bloomberg's Kaylee Lies for more. Hey, Kaylee.
Hey, John. Well, I would argue the market isn't just warming up to the idea of a blue wave. It's starting largely to price it in. The thesis, of course, being, as Alessio De Longo was alluding to, that a blue wave means it will be easier to push through large-scale fiscal stimulus and, as a result, end up with stronger economic growth. And you're already seeing that reflected in the market in recent days, in that those economically sensitive cyclical sectors and small caps are outperforming, while it is tech that is lagging behind. And in the bond market, we've seen strategist after strategist call for higher yields at the longer end of the curve. In the case of a blue sweep, we are starting to see that show up, and a steepening of the curve on this election day. As we have been talking about, John, right now the spread between 5 and 30-year notes is sitting around 126 basis points. Again, the thesis being more stimulus leading to stronger growth. That's the positive end of the blue wave scenario that the market is seeing, but it would bring some negatives too, John, most notably when it comes to tax policy. Biden planning to raise the corporate tax rate to 28%, and you're already seeing fear about that show up in the market, in that when you look at a basket of higher tax stocks and a basket of lower tax stocks, those that have to pay higher taxes already have been underperforming over the course of the past month. The market really bracing itself for a potential increase in tax rates. I have to round it out here, John, though, by saying that a blue wave is far from a certainty right now. When you look at betting markets, they are pricing just over a 50% chance that it actually happens. And in the case that it doesn't, a lot of these trades that are already happening are going to have to unwind, John.
Kelly Lyons, thank you. We're doing it all over again. 4 years ago, no one knew what they were talking about, and 4 years later, just feels like no one really knows, once again, what any of these outcomes would mean for this market. Stifel's Barry Bannister weighing the potential market implications of a blue wave, writing the following, quote, "We suspect that stocks would rise sharply with a clear blue wave, but any stimulus-anticipated rapid Fed response may be a buy-the-rumor, sell-the-fact event. If the Senate or presidency stay Republican, the S&P 500 probably sells off initially as fiscal stimulus visibility fades, lifting the dollar and real yields." Barry joins us now. Barry, it's fantastic to have you on the program with us today. You're always far more nuanced than most on the different permutations and what they mean for financial markets. Barry, can you walk me through what you're looking for in the next 24 hours and what you think the outcome of the outcomes might be?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, generally speaking, Trump is better for growth stocks. That would be like tech and consumer discretionary, which of course includes Amazon. Biden would be better for value stocks. Think financials, industrials, and oddly, even energy, because the dollar would probably be debased, and that drives up oil prices. If you look at right now, though, it's very interesting, but the pure-out defensives, the equal-weighted staples, healthcare, utilities, and the level 2 industry telephones, relative to the S&P, have only been this cheap 3 times in 50 years. So the market is very uncertain at this point. But again, Trump is growth, Biden is value.
Barry, walk me through the balance of risks around that breakdown. When you look at the financials,
Position closed on Swissy at 0.9146.
when do we start to process that extra nuance around the sector level story?
Yeah. Well, the nuance is really that what's different this time is that normally when you loosen up fiscal policy, you tighten monetary policy as an offset. This time you have loose monetary and loose fiscal policy, which is reflationary. If it is a blue wave, as you said, what you'd have is reflation, a weaker dollar, a steeper curve. Now, housing might slow if this curve steepens too much. You'd have a lower PE but higher EPS. And so those markets, those value markets, tend to go up, but they also go up less in terms of degree than the growth markets. The growth markets would be the opposite of all those outcomes.
Barry, a Bloomberg subscriber has written in and asked the best sector to hold through 2021. If you can answer that and also tell us how dependent that would be on the results of the next 24 hours.
Well, if it's Trump and Republican Senate, I would say that technology, this is particularly these fan mag stocks, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Microsoft, Apple, Google, they would outperform. And if it's Biden, I would say financial stocks, because the curve would steepen. They're very cheap. They would benefit from this macro environment of reflation. And so those are the two extremes here.
Can you walk me through how defensive you are, Barry, going into this event?
You know, I think that obviously the market thought Trump's odds are about 35%, but I think it's closer to 50-50. And what really matters is the Senate. You know, our focus for months, and when I last spoke to you, was on the Senate. The Senate, through the parliamentary procedures, has a lot of impact. Think about the filibuster. Think about the danger of blowing up the filibuster, as we found out in 2013 when Reid did it, and of course McConnell turned it back on him with the Supreme Court. Think about reconciliation. That's how they passed the 2017 tax cut. That's a 10-year revenue neutral terminus bill, and that would mean the taxes come up sooner, I would think, and that would be market negative. So you got to really focus on the Senate tonight. I would focus on that more than the White House.
Barry, just finally from me, how much of your outlook then is held hostage by this election?